Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The night was dark and my headlights were weak on that dirt road. I felt a heaviness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. There was no music playing. I had turned off the radio because it was nothing but static. The only sound I heard was the rumble of the engine and the thud of my heart against my ribs. I kept my foot on the gas and tried not to think about anything except getting home. But that was before I saw those three figures standing by the fence waving for me to stop. I work a freelance gig taking care of animals at a small ranch outside the city. It's not the most glamorous job, but it helps me pay my bills. That day I stayed later than usual because one of the horses had an injured leg. I spent a few extra hours cleaning the wound and making sure the horse was comfortable. By the time I finished, the sun was gone and the dirt roads around the ranch were pitch black. I was tired, dirty, and ready for a hot shower. I chose a back route to shave off sometime, which turned out to be a decision I still regret. I'd driven this way a few times before, but never this late. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. My headlights lit up only a narrow patch of road in front of me. Every bump felt like it would break my suspension, and every shadow made me uneasy. The road snaked between low hills and overgrown bushes. I kept checking my side mirrors to make sure nothing was following me. I don't know why I felt that urge, but something about that night felt off. As I rounded a tight bend, I saw three people near a wire fence on the left side of the road. They were waving, like they wanted me to stop. They didn't have a car nearby, and I wondered how they got there. All I could see at first were their outlines in my headlights. I slowed down enough to make out their faces. They looked like regular adults wearing jeans and jackets. One of them had his hand up in a thumbs-up gesture, but it wasn't a friendly thumbs-up. It looked forced. His mouth stretched in a way that made my stomach twist. I thought about stopping for a second. They might have been stranded. They might have needed a jump or a ride. But as soon as I got closer, I felt a jolt of panic. My gut told me something was very wrong. They were standing too still. They weren't shouting or showing any real distress. They were just there, like they were waiting. I caught the eyes of one of them, a taller guy with a scruffy beard. He smiled at me, but there was no warmth in it. It felt like he was testing me, like he wanted to see if I was dumb enough to stop. I kept my foot on the accelerator. I didn't slow down much, just enough to take in the scene. My heart started pounding faster when one of them, the tall guy, took a step toward the road, lifting his arms as if he was trying to wave me down more aggressively. My instincts kicked in. I pressed on the gas. The car lurched forward and I passed them. In my rearview mirror, I saw that same tall guy start running behind me, like he thought he could catch up. My chest got tight. I couldn't see if the other two followed, but my eyes were locked on the tall one. He kept running until my taillights faded from his view. Then I lost sight of him. I tried to calm myself, but my breathing was ragged. Sweat formed on my forehead, even though the night air was chilly. I wiped my face with my sleeve. My hands trembled on the wheel. My shoulders felt tense and locked. I kept expecting my phone to ring or something, but there was only silence. My phone was on the passenger seat. The screen had no signal bars. Out here, the coverage was patchy at best. I glanced at it, hoping I could get at least one bar to call for help, or at least call a friend. Nothing. I started running through scenarios in my head. Could those people have been harmless? Maybe they just needed help. But then I remembered the tall guy's grin. It wasn't right. I felt a chill in my spine. My eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror longer than they should have, and I almost ran over a rock the size of a basketball. I swerved just in time, tires skidding on loose gravel. I didn't see any sign of them behind me anymore, but that didn't stop the tension in my body. I felt like I needed to keep driving, keep putting distance between me and that spot. My mind kept flashing back to the guy's face, that strange smile, and the way he started sprinting. Why run after a moving car unless you're unhinged or desperate? For a minute, I thought about turning around. It was a stupid thought, but my mind wasn't working normally. I was wondering if maybe someone was hurt and the tall guy was just panicked. But no. My gut told me not to do that. Something about the whole setup felt like a trap. My mouth went dry. I reached for an old water bottle I had on the floor and took a swig. The water tasted stale, but it was cold enough to steady my nerves a little. The road ahead looked the same for miles. Dirt, gravel, some potholes. No streetlights. I had planned to hit pavement about 8 miles from the ranch. I glanced at the odometer. I was 4 miles in, so I had around 4 more to go. I told myself I'd see real lights soon and maybe some other cars. But in the meantime, I was alone in the dark. My chest got tighter every time I heard a noise. Most of the sounds came from my own car. Loose tools rattling in the trunk or the creaking of the suspension. But every time something rattled, I tensed up and glanced in the mirrors again. Eventually, I found a straighter stretch of road and pushed the gas harder. The engine roared a bit and I held the wheel steady. Dust kicked up behind me, forming a cloud in the headlights of whoever might be behind me, if anyone was there. But I didn't see any lights. It was just me and the darkness. After a few minutes, the road dipped and I saw another bend coming up. I slowed to avoid losing control. My heart was still going too fast, and I realized I needed to focus on driving, or I'd end up in a ditch. My eyes scanned the sides of the road, looking for anything unusual. I saw a collapsed wooden fence and a few dead shrubs. Nothing else. I tried to breathe more steadily. Inhale, exhale. My grip on the steering wheel loosened a bit. Then I saw a faint light up ahead. It looked like it was coming from another vehicle. I felt a jolt of hope, or at least relief. Maybe I wasn't alone anymore. As I got closer, I saw it was an old pickup parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights on. The tailgate was down, and the driver's door was open. I slowed down, cautious but curious. If this was another sign of trouble, I needed to be ready. I pulled up next to the pickup, leaving a few feet of space. I rolled down my window just enough to talk without giving anyone easy access to my car. "Hey," I called out. My voice sounded shaky. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder this time. "Hello? Do you need help?" A man stepped out from behind the truck. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap and a heavy jacket. His hands were visible, and I didn't see any weapon. He walked over, but he kept a decent distance. "Engine died," he said. His voice was low but calm. "Battery's acting up." My heart was still pumping from earlier, and I wasn't sure I wanted to trust this guy. But he seemed normal. He scratched his head, looked at me with a nervous grin, and said, "I tried calling for a tow, but I have no signal." I checked my phone again. Still no service. I figured I could at least offer him a jump, but I was worried about those 3 people I'd left behind. I looked in the rearview mirror, then scanned the darkness ahead. No sign of them, no sign of anyone else. The hair on my arms still stood up. "I can try giving you a jump," I said. "I have cables in the trunk." I wanted to get this done fast. He nodded, looked relieved, and motioned for me to pull up a bit. I did, then popped the trunk. I got out of the car, though my legs felt shaky. I grabbed the jumper cables and tried not to think about the possibility that this was a setup. My heart thumped harder when I realized how exposed I was in the open. The man walked to his hood, which was already popped. I hooked up the cables, telling him which clamp went where. He cooperated, doing exactly what I said. I started my engine, and he tried his. It sputtered a few times, then roared to life. He let out a short laugh that sounded genuine. He gave me a thumbs up. I exhaled, relieved that nothing had gone wrong during that exchange. "Thanks a lot," he said. "I appreciate it." I forced a smile. "No problem. Just be careful out here." He nodded, but he must have seen I was on edge. "You okay? You look a bit tense." I wiped my face with my sleeve. I told him about the 3 people I saw earlier. I kept it brief and straight. He frowned, then glanced at the direction I came from. "That's strange," he said. You sure they didn't have a car? I shook my head. Not that I could see. He scratched his chin and looked around, like he was expecting them to show up any second. That made me even more nervous. I'll be careful, he said. I'm heading in the opposite direction anyway, so maybe I'll miss them. You drive safe. We disconnected the cables, and I tossed them back in my trunk. He shut his hood. I started my car again and pulled onto the road. He turned off his hazards and followed a few seconds behind me, heading in the direction I was going. It felt better to know someone else was out there, but I also didn't want to slow down. For the next mile or so, his headlights were in my mirror. Then the road split at a fork. Left led toward a small town, right continued to the main highway. I took the right fork, and he took the left. Now I was alone again. I noticed my heart rate hadn't gone back to normal. My shoulders were still stiff. I kept replaying the scene with those three people. My mouth was dry again, and I realized I was pressing on the gas harder than usual. I finally reached the paved road. I felt a rush of relief when I saw the familiar reflective markers and a small metal sign indicating the highway was 3 miles ahead. I eased up on the throttle because the pavement was better than the dirt, and I could maintain a steady speed without worrying about potholes. My mind started to clear a bit, and I tried to focus on the fact that I was almost home. Then I noticed a shape in the ditch to my right. It looked like a piece of metal. Maybe an old sign or part of a broken fence. I kept my eyes on it as I passed. It was just debris, but it reminded me of the fence where I saw those people. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. Still nothing behind me. I checked my phone one more time. Still no signal. I wanted to call someone, anyone, just to calm my nerves. The fear was still there, sitting in my stomach, making me feel uneasy. I kept driving, eyes ahead. My skin felt clammy. Each minute seemed to drag on. I heard my own breathing. I realized I'd been breathing in short bursts like I couldn't get enough air. When I finally saw the faint lights of a service station ahead, I let out a sigh. The station was near the junction with the main highway. The fluorescent bulbs lit up the pumps in a small convenience store. I decided to stop. I wanted to shake off the tension, maybe wash my face and check if I had a signal again. As I pulled in, I felt the normal crackle of gravel under my tires. It was reassuring to see something man-made and well-lit. I parked near one of the pumps, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The cold air hit me, and I took a deep breath. My hands were still shaking a bit. I walked into the store and grabbed a soda from the cooler. The fluorescent lights buzzed. It smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. The cashier was a woman in her 20s. She gave me a polite nod. I set the soda on the counter and fumbled for my wallet. I realized my shirt was damp with sweat. "You all right, hun?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but I could tell she noticed how rattled I looked. I nodded and forced a small laugh. "Long drive on a rough road," I said. I paid for the soda, and she gave me my change. I opened the can right there and took a long drink. It helped calm my nerves. I stepped back outside, popped the trunk, and searched for my phone charger. I found it, plugged it into the car's power port, and checked my phone again. One bar of signal finally appeared. I felt a hint of relief. I could call someone if I wanted to. I thought about calling a friend to tell them what happened, but I decided against it. I just wanted to get home. I sat there for a minute, finishing my drink, looking around the empty station lot. A couple of moths fluttered around the bright lights. The rest was silent. After a few more minutes, I turned the key in the ignition and pulled out onto the highway. The road was smooth, and there were a few streetlights here and there. My shoulders gradually relaxed. I drove at a normal speed, feeling safer with every mile that passed. Yet I couldn't stop looking in my rearview mirror, expecting to see that tall guy's face or any sign of those other people. But the road behind me stayed empty. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I felt more in control. I took a few deep breaths and kept my eyes on the traffic lights ahead. There were a few cars passing by, going about their business. The normal lights and the presence of other drivers made me feel grounded again. I turned onto the side street that led to my place. My body was still tense, but at least the worst part of the night seemed over. When I pulled into my driveway, I killed the engine and sat there, staring at my quiet house. I realized I wasn't sure how to move past the fear I'd felt on that dirt road. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the tall man's grin. My hands started shaking again. My mouth felt dry. I opened and closed my fists a few times, trying to steady my breathing. Then I grabbed my phone, wallet, and keys. I got out of the car and locked it. Inside my house, I didn't turn on all the lights. I just went to the kitchen, tossed my keys on the counter, and leaned against the sink. My mind replayed the scene over and over. That fence, those 3 people, the way he ran after me. I could practically hear my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for a glass, filled it with water, and drank it. The cold water felt good. It reminded me that I was home and safe. I walked to the bedroom. My legs felt heavy. I kicked off my shoes and took off my dirty clothes from the ranch. My thoughts were still racing. I grabbed my phone and finally got a decent signal. I saw a couple of missed messages from friends, but nothing urgent. I typed out a message to one of them, saying I'd had a strange night and would tell him about it later. Then I plugged the phone in to charge. I considered calling the police, but I didn't know what I'd say. I didn't know who those people were, or if they were even still out there. No crime had happened that I knew of. I felt a bit silly, like maybe I was overreacting. But my gut told me it wasn't a normal situation. That grin was still in my head. I decided to wait, hoping I'd calm down by morning. My heart was still beating too fast, but I forced myself to lie down. I pulled the blanket over me and stared at the dark ceiling. I could feel my pulse in my temples. I focused on my breathing, trying to slow it down. Eventually, my body gave in, and I felt myself drift into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with images of a dark road, flickering headlights, and a figure chasing me. But in the real world, for now, it was quiet. I should have taken someone with me. I realize that now. At the time, I thought I could handle an empty prison on my own. I thought I was prepared for the silence, the darkness, and the uncertainty of a place long abandoned. I was wrong. This story still makes my hands shake. I can't explain everything I experienced, but I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you exactly how it felt to stand in those corridors with my flashlight flickering and my breath turning shallow. I'll tell you about those footsteps echoing from a place that should have been empty. My name is Daniel. I'm in my late 30s, and I've been working in historical restoration projects for about a decade. I've seen a lot of old buildings. I've crawled through basements filled with soggy boxes and rotting beams. I've poked around attic spaces where the dust made it impossible to breathe. I've walked in places with signs of squatters or vandalism. But nothing ever gave me the kind of anxiety I felt that day in the abandoned prison. I had driven out early in the morning. It was about an hour outside the city. The roads were narrow and the pavement had cracks big enough to rattle my truck. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. After a while, there were only empty lots, rusted fences, and dead grass along the edges of the road. I reached a tall chain-link gate with a broken padlock. A faded sign read "No trespassing," but I had a permit from the local government to assess the building. I pushed the gate aside, then parked on a patch of concrete near the front entrance. From outside, the prison looked massive. The walls were high, made of old, weathered stone. There were metal bars on the windows, all of them rusted and bent. Tall weeds grew out of cracks in the pavement. When I got out of my truck, the wind carried a smell of damp concrete and decay. It reminded me of basement crawl spaces, but stronger. I zipped my jacket and grabbed my tools, a clipboard, a small flashlight, my phone, and some basic equipment for measuring cracks in the foundation. I also brought a camera, hoping to document everything for my records. The front doors were huge and made of heavy wood. They had large iron hinges that were flaking with rust. I pulled one door open with some effort. It creaked and groaned like it hadn't been moved in years. Dust swirled in the sunlight, and I noticed how quiet it was. No passing cars, no birds, just my own breathing and the sound of my boots scraping the floor. Right inside was a lobby area with a wide desk. The desk was chipped and covered in a thick layer of dust. I saw a few old chairs in the corner. Their cushions were torn and stuffing poked out in clumps. I took a few pictures. Then I walked toward a hallway that led into the main cell blocks. My plan was to check the structural integrity of the floors and walls. I also wanted to see if there was any major water damage or mold. I moved slowly, shining my flashlight around because the windows were boarded up or sealed with old metal bars. The corridors felt cramped. My steps echoed, and the air felt stale. As I walked, I noticed old posters and notices on the walls. Most were faded to the point where I couldn't read them. Some had peeling edges that fluttered when there was a draft. I ran my hand over the rough stone a few times to check for cracks. My fingertips came away dirty and gritty. There was a faint dripping sound somewhere, so I followed it. I found a small leak from a pipe near the ceiling. Rusty water was dripping into a puddle on the floor. I jotted down a note on my clipboard. Plumbing compromised. Eventually, I reached a row of cells. The metal bars were thick and coated in rust. The smell in that area was stronger. It was a mix of mold, old metal, and dampness. I shone my flashlight into each cell. I saw nothing but empty bunks, peeling paint, and layers of dust. Some of the doors were locked, others hung open. One door was missing entirely, leaving only the hinges behind. I listened carefully. All I heard was my own breathing and the constant drip of water somewhere nearby. I continued down the corridor until I reached a set of stairs leading to the second floor. A sign on the wall said, "Cell Block B." The stairs were concrete, and I checked them for cracks. Everything seemed stable enough for me to go up. I decided I'd finish with the ground floor first, then head upstairs. So I walked back, measuring certain parts of the walls and scribbling notes. The gloom of the place was getting to me, but I kept my focus on the job. At least that was my goal. It must have been about an hour later when I reached the administrative offices. This section had a few windows, so there was a bit of natural light coming through, but most were boarded. The doors were either locked or stuck. I forced one open and found an old office with a desk, some file cabinets, and a broken chair. The room smelled like old paper and rust. I saw some paperwork scattered on the floor, but the text was smudged and illegible. I took a few more photos. I decided to take a short break. I leaned against a wall and took a sip of water from my bottle. My back felt stiff, and the quiet made me uneasy. I checked my phone for a signal, but there was nothing. I wasn't surprised. I made a mental note to be careful. If something happened, I might not be able to call for help. The silence pressed in on me, and I realized I hadn't heard any normal sounds for a while. No wind, no rats scurrying, nothing. I stood there thinking about my next steps. Then I heard it. Footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the ceiling toward the opposite corner. They stopped for a moment, then continued. My heart rate jumped. My mouth felt dry. I swallowed and tried to think rationally. Maybe there was a squatter. Maybe a local explorer had come in. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed down the corridor, but there was no reply. I waited, hoping to hear something else. But the footsteps had stopped. It was silent again. I told myself I needed to check the second floor anyway, so I gathered my tools and headed back to the stairs. Each step up felt heavier than before. My nerves were on edge, and my hands felt clammy. When I reached the top, I pointed my flashlight down the hallway. It was similar to the floor below. Metal doors on either side, some open, some locked. Dust floated in the air. Everything was still. I walked carefully, aiming the flashlight at each cell door. Some had rusty padlocks. Others were sealed with thick boards. One door had a broken hinge, so I nudged it open with my foot. Inside, there was nothing but an overturned bed frame and some debris. I kept going, checking each room. I saw graffiti on a few walls, messages I couldn't quite make out. There were a few symbols, but they were scribbled so roughly that I didn't pay much attention. I felt the temperature drop at one point. It wasn't dramatic, but it made me shiver. I checked the windows, thinking a breeze had gotten in, but all the windows were sealed. The hair on my arms stood up. My chest felt tight, and my breathing got shallow. I forced myself to calm down. I reminded myself that old buildings can have drafts from unseen gaps in the walls or ceilings. Then I heard another sound. It was faint, but it felt close. It was the same kind of footstep I'd heard below, only slower. It came from somewhere to my left. I froze. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I listened carefully, but the steps stopped again. I took a deep breath and moved toward the left hallway. My boots scraped on the concrete, and I tried to step more quietly. The hallway ended in a heavy metal door with a sign that said, "No entry." It was chained shut from my side. The chain looked old and rusted. I tugged on it. It didn't budge. There was a small gap under the door, but it was too small to see through. I didn't hear anything else. My instincts told me that nobody was there, but my gut told me something was off. I felt a slight pressure in my ears, like the air was heavier. My body felt tense. I glanced back, making sure nothing was behind me. The corridor was empty. I rubbed my temples and tried to focus. I decided to check the rest of the floor, maybe finish my notes, and then leave. The place felt wrong, and I didn't want to push my luck. I walked through the rest of the second floor. I took a few more pictures of the cracked walls and the peeling paint. I found a small closet with cleaning supplies that had turned to a solid block of rusty metal. I saw a control panel that probably managed the electricity or plumbing in the past, but it looked beyond repair. The entire time, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. My jaw stayed clenched, and I kept wiping sweat from my forehead. The building seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't get the footsteps out of my mind. After finishing my inspection, I headed back to the stairs. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Each time I saw the same dark hallway. Nothing moved. When I finally reached the ground floor, I felt a small wave of relief. My plan was to check the yard area, but I couldn't relax. The echo of those footsteps kept looping in my head. I thought about calling out again, but something told me it wouldn't do any good. I decided to wrap up. I headed for the exit near the front desk. The floor felt a bit slick, and I noticed some greenish moss growing in the corners. My flashlight flickered once or twice, and I cursed under my breath. I smacked it, and the light steadied. Outside the front doors, the sky looked grayer than before, and the wind had picked up. I stepped out and took a long breath. The stale air of the prison stayed in my nostrils, but I felt more grounded. I walked around the outside perimeter, making sure the foundation wasn't crumbling anywhere else. The walls had cracks, but nothing extreme. I saw more rusted fences and barbed wire. I took pictures and made notes on my clipboard. At one point, I tried to shake off the lingering fear by focusing on the job. I noted the corners where the water might pool. I checked an old drainage channel that was clogged with debris. My phone still had no signal, so I decided to wait until I got back on the main road to call my contact at the local historical society. After I finished outside, I walked back to my truck and set my tools in the passenger seat. I leaned against the door and looked at the prison building. It stood there, silent, with the same broken windows and rusted bars, but now it felt different. I couldn't stop remembering those footsteps. They sounded so real. It wasn't just one or two. It was a series of steps, like someone was walking a path upstairs. But I found nothing and nobody. I double-checked the area to see if another car was parked somewhere. There was nothing. No fresh tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt or weeds. I had a weird urge to go back inside and search every single room. But that urge was quickly smothered by the sense of dread in my gut. I wasn't about to wander deeper into that place alone, not after what I heard. I started the engine and pulled away from the prison. The gate was still open, so I drove through it and headed down the cracked road. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror for no reason. The road felt longer on the way out. Eventually, I caught a few bars of signal on my phone, so I pulled over to the side and called my contact. I told them I'd done the inspection, but I didn't mention the footsteps. I just gave a brief report. The building was in rough shape, the plumbing was shot, and the structure needed serious reinforcement. They asked if I'd be willing to come back with a team. I said yes, but only if I had other people there. I didn't want to be alone in that place again. Once I was back on a main highway, I felt some tension lift. The normal sights and sounds of cars passing by and signs of life made me breathe easier. My mind, however, kept replaying the sound of those footsteps above me. They were distinct. They had a certain pace, a certain weight. I couldn't figure out how it could be anything but a person. Yet I found no one, no signs of recent trespassers, no footprints in the dust, no open doors upstairs. I know some people might say I imagined it. They'll say an old building has plenty of noises, creaks, settling foundations, or wind. But these were footstep sounds. They were measured, one after the other, like someone was deliberately walking. I don't have an explanation. All I have is the memory. I still plan to work on that prison project. The money is decent, and it's not every day I get to oversee a place with so much history. But the next time I enter those corridors, I'll have a few coworkers with me. I won't rely on my lone flashlight and a few notes in a dusty notebook. I want more eyes and ears around just to keep my nerves in check. I don't consider myself a superstitious person, but I can't deny how that place made me feel. To this day, when I think about it, I remember the thick air, the rusty bars, and the emptiness. I remember how my heart pounded when I heard those steps above me, and how cold my fingertips felt when I climbed the stairs. That prison is still out there. It's still standing in that quiet patch of land, hidden by overgrowth and neglected by time. And it still holds secrets that no one can fully explain. I only know what I heard. And I'll never forget that moment when I realized I wasn't alone, even though I never saw a single soul. I should have picked a modern location with steady floors, but I wanted something cheap and authentic for my video project. I heard about this old packaging factory that shut down 2 decades ago. People said it was big, empty, and easy to access through a side entrance. They warned me about weak floors and rusted metal, but I assumed I'd be careful enough. I climbed a side stairwell, reached the 2nd floor, and then the floor gave way under me. I caught myself on the edge, half my body dangling over a pit of twisted metal. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my temples. That was when I heard footsteps somewhere down a dark corridor. My boot slid on crumbling concrete, and I grabbed a rusted pipe for balance. The pipe felt cold and slick with grime. I took a breath through my nose. The air tasted stale and bitter, like old dust. The hole I'd partially fallen into was about 3 feet wide, torn through the floorboards and concrete. Sharp pieces of rebar stuck out at weird angles. If I'd fallen all the way through, I might have been impaled or at least broken a leg. I stayed still until my pulse calmed a little. My eyes flicked around, but the place was so dim I could only see shapes and shadows. I listened for the footsteps again. I'd heard them once, fast and heavy. Someone or something running. But then nothing. My first instinct was to call out, but I wasn't sure if I should. I didn't know who else might be here, and I didn't want to spook them or draw attention to myself if they weren't friendly. My hand tightened around that pipe. I moved my free hand to the floor, trying to find a solid beam or piece of concrete to push myself up. The edges of the hole cracked as I shifted my weight. A chunk of debris tumbled into the darkness below. I heard it bounce off something metal. The echo traveled through the factory like a dull clang. I stayed quiet and listened. Still no more footsteps. I whispered a few choice words to myself. My arms were starting to burn. The pipe rattled a bit when I pulled on it. It felt solid enough for the moment, so I pushed with my right foot, lifted my body, and scrambled onto firmer ground. The floor creaked but held me. I kneeled there, breathing hard through my mouth. My throat felt dry. A sour taste lingered at the back of my tongue. Once I was back on my feet, I looked around. The 2nd floor office area was basically a large open room with a few partitions made of old plywood. Broken glass crunched under my boots. A single row of windows lined the far wall, but the glass was yellowed or missing in some places. Light came in from the late afternoon sun, but it wasn't much. The corners stayed wrapped in shadows. Exposed wires hung from the ceiling. They swayed a bit every time I moved, like the vibrations traveled through the floor to the walls and ceiling. I turned around and eyed the hole. My left knee shook a little from the rush of adrenaline. The area around the hole looked weak, so I stepped wide and moved away. Then I heard the footsteps again. This time they sounded more distant. I couldn't tell which direction they were going. Could have been somewhere below me or off to the left. The noise was faint, kind of like boots scraping on concrete, then a shuffling sound. It stopped as quickly as it started. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My thoughts raced. Was it another urban explorer? A homeless person? A security guard? It didn't feel like a place that had security, but who knows? Maybe it was just an animal. But the footsteps seemed too heavy for that. I decided I needed to figure out if someone was there. I also wanted to see if there was a safer section of the building to check out for filming. That big hole in the floor changed my approach. I moved along the perimeter, stepping carefully. Each time I put my foot down, I tested the floor. Sometimes I heard a crunch or felt the floor sink a little under my weight. My pulse would spike each time and I'd freeze. But I kept going. I reached a doorway that led to another corridor. Old graffiti covered the walls. The letters and symbols made no sense to me. Some of it was faded, some looked fresh. The smell in this hallway was heavier. It reeked of mildew and what might have been urine. I grimaced. My hands hung at my sides, fingers twitchy. I felt like I needed to keep them ready in case something jumped at me. Down the corridor, I saw a few doors on each side. Most were closed. The closest door on the right was open just a crack. I approached, careful not to brush against the wall. The paint was flaking in big chips, and I didn't want any of it on me if I could help it. I pushed the door lightly with my foot. It resisted at first, then scraped open. The hinges squeaked, echoing down the corridor. I waited for a response. Silence. Inside was a small office, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. An old metal desk sat in the center, missing drawers. The floor was covered in broken glass, scraps of paper, and some dead leaves. A single overhead light fixture dangled by a cord, obviously not working. A battered filing cabinet stood in the corner, half open. I stepped inside. The floor felt a bit more solid here. There was a window facing the main factory floor below. I walked to it and peered out. The main floor was a massive space. Rows of large machines were scattered around, with conveyor belts leading in random directions. Piles of rusted metal, collapsed pallets, and old boxes formed small hills of debris. Light poured in through large overhead windows in the ceiling, but they were filthy. Most of the light had that dusty glow. I scanned for movement. Nothing. The silence started to get under my skin. I heard the footsteps again, but they were definitely below me now. The sound was louder, a clear, steady pounding of feet on concrete. Then it stopped. My fingers gripped the edge of the window frame. I felt my breathing pick up. I forced myself to slow down, inhale through my nose, exhale through my mouth. I told myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just a big rat scurrying around. But that didn't make sense. Rats don't pound like that. I backed away from the window and returned to the corridor. I considered heading back to the stairs. The side stairwell I used to get in was narrow, but at least I knew it was still intact. Then I remembered the whole reason I came here. Location scouting. I forced myself to keep going. I told myself I'd do a quick check, snap a few photos on my phone, and then leave. No reason to explore too deep. Just enough to see if it would work for my project. I passed a few more doors. They were locked or blocked. One was barricaded with a piece of plywood nailed across. The corridor smelled worse the further I went. At one point, the overhead light fixtures were completely gone, leaving me with only the faint glow from broken windows behind me. After a few more steps, I reached another open door on the left. I glanced inside. It looked like a break room. There was a dented soda machine, a couple of filthy tables, and chairs scattered around. The floor in there looked rough, with water damage near the far wall. I saw mold creeping up the drywall. It was greenish-brown, and the air felt damp. I took a step in. My foot landed on something that snapped under my weight. I froze. I aimed my phone's flashlight downward. It was a broken piece of plastic, probably from the soda machine. I exhaled, relieved it wasn't anything worse. Then I noticed footprints in the dust on the floor. They were shaped like boots, not animal prints. They led to the corner of the room. The corner was dark, so I aimed my phone light there. The footprints ended near a small door I hadn't noticed at first. It might have been a closet or a storage space. The door was slightly ajar. My gut tightened. I listened. No sound from behind that door. I debated opening it. My hands felt clammy. My heart rate picked up again, drumming in my chest. I told myself I needed to be sure nobody was squatting there. I didn't want to get attacked or surprise someone. I approached it, steadying my breathing as best I could. I used my phone in my right hand, my left hand on the door's edge. I pushed it open slowly. It creaked. Inside was a narrow closet, filled with mops, brooms, and an overturned bucket. Dust coated everything. There was a small window at the back, letting in a sliver of light. No one was in there. I felt relief flood through me. Then I heard footsteps again, out in the corridor, close by. They were quick, like someone passing in a hurry. My heart hammered. I stepped out of the break room and looked both ways down the corridor. Empty. I couldn't see a soul. The footsteps faded in seconds. I snapped a few quick photos of the corridor, the break room door, and the walls. My plan was to show them to my team later, but now all I wanted was to get out of there. Something about hearing footsteps and never seeing anyone felt wrong. I didn't want to push my luck. I retraced my steps, moving faster this time. I kept checking behind me. Every time I passed an open door, I felt a prickle on my skin. I clenched my fists a few times to release tension. My shoulders felt stiff. When I reached the office where I'd first looked down on the main floor, I hesitated. I decided to walk downstairs through a different set of stairs that might connect to the main factory floor. Maybe that route was safer. I didn't want to risk that same side stairwell if there was a chance someone was waiting there. I found a wide metal staircase on the far side of the office area. It looked sturdier. Thick steps, big bolts, minimal rust. I slowly descended. Each step let out a dull vibration. I tried to move quietly, but it was impossible to be silent on that old metal. My phone flashlight showed that the walls were chipped and covered in random graffiti. The air smelled like old oil down here. At the bottom of the stairs, I reached a big open door leading onto the main factory floor. The space was bigger than I realized from above. Tall columns rose up, spaced about 20 feet apart. Conveyor belts and large machines with gears and rollers stood silent and dusty. I moved among them, staying alert. My footsteps sounded muffled on the concrete. Debris crunched. Broken pallets and old packaging materials were scattered everywhere. I took a few more photos, deciding I'd done enough to get a sense of the location. Halfway across the factory floor, I heard the footsteps again. This time, it sounded like someone walking on the metal staircase I'd just come down. I spun around. I could see the staircase in the distance. My phone's flashlight didn't reach that far, but I saw movement. A slight shift of a shadow. I couldn't make out a figure, but the steps were loud. My nerves jumped. I glanced left and right, looking for an exit sign or any door that might lead outside. The nearest door I saw looked chained shut. A big padlock hung there, rusted but intact. I decided to move toward the corner of the building where I saw a possible loading area. Sometimes those loading docks have big doors that open to the outside. I threaded my way between piles of metal scraps and a forklift that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. The air felt cold, like a chill had suddenly settled in. My mouth felt dry again. My ears strained for any sounds of pursuit. Then I heard footsteps on the concrete behind me. They seemed faster, like someone jogging. I crouched behind a tall machine with rollers and peeked around. I saw a shadow pass between two columns. It was definitely a person, but I couldn't make out details. They wore dark clothing, or maybe it was just the low light. They stopped for a second near a set of shelves stacked with boxes. Then they moved again, heading away from me. I heard their footsteps fade in the direction of the stairs I came down earlier. I didn't waste any more time. I bolted for the loading area. My boots struck the concrete, sending echoes bouncing around the giant space. Each step felt heavy. My heart pounded in my ears. I reached the loading docks. There were 3 large garage-style doors. 2 were sealed shut with heavy chains. The middle one looked partially open at the bottom, about a foot of space between the door and the ground. I crouched and peered underneath. It led outside. I could see daylight, or what was left of it. I dropped to my stomach and slid under the door. My jacket caught on a jagged piece of metal on the door's edge. I yanked it free, ripping the fabric. I cursed, but I kept going. Once outside, I stood up. My hands trembled. My knees felt weak. The area behind the factory was a small concrete lot, fenced in by chain link. Parts of the fence were collapsed or bent, so I headed that way. I looked over my shoulder once. I saw no movement under the garage door, no footsteps behind me. The sky was turning orange-gray, and I knew I had to get out of there. I squeezed through a gap in the fence, scraping my forearm in the process. A small line of blood appeared, but I ignored it. I walked quickly down a dirt path that led to a side street. As I reached the pavement, I turned back one last time. The old factory loomed in the fading light. It was silent again, no sign of anyone. My mouth felt dry and my hand shook when I finally pulled out my phone to call a friend. I told him I'd found a place, but I didn't mention the footsteps right then. I just said it was too dangerous, with weak floors. I'd look for somewhere else. I could still feel my heart hammering in my chest. My skin felt clammy, and I couldn't stop replaying those heavy footsteps in my head. I went home, locked my door, and tried to forget about the entire thing. But I kept thinking about that hole in the second floor and those footprints in the break room. I wasn't sure if it was a squatter, a guard, or someone else. Maybe it was just another explorer who thought I was the threat. All I know is that I felt like I was being watched. The tension in my shoulders still hasn't gone away. That factory isn't just an empty building. It has something going on inside, and I want nothing to do with it ever again. I parked my car on a dirt patch at the side of the empty road. The old church stood in front of a wide field, dark and quiet under the fading light. I felt a tightness in my chest, just looking at it. The walls were worn, and the roof had missing shingles in a few spots. I had heard rumors it was shut down years ago because the congregation moved on or stopped coming. I wanted photos at dusk because I like the way old buildings look when the sun's almost gone. I never expected to see any kind of activity in there, but I saw a weak flickering light coming from one of the windows. It pulsed, then disappeared, then came back again, like someone was trying to signal, or maybe had a lantern. I grabbed my camera bag and stepped out of the car. The wind was cold against my face, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. The field felt endless. I listened for any sounds of passing cars, but the road was silent. I stood still, checking the place. The church's front doors seemed locked. They were boarded up and secured with a chain. The building looked intimidating in the low light. Its tall windows had no color, just dirty glass. No sign of movement. But I saw that flickering again, coming from around the right side, possibly through a window near the altar area. I glanced at the front door once more and decided I wouldn't be able to get in that way. I walked around the side of the building, my footsteps loud in the gravel and dried weeds. The temperature was dropping fast, and I pulled my jacket tighter. On the north side, I saw a door that seemed pried open or broken. One hinge was loose. There were scratch marks on the wood like someone forced it. I didn't see any footprints, but it was too dark to tell for sure. I paused to think if this was wise. It might be someone up to no good. But my curiosity got the best of me. I told myself maybe it was just car headlights bouncing off a window or some reflection. Still, the place was quiet, and that flicker was too steady to be random. I pushed the door. It creaked and swung in without much resistance. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. My throat tightened a bit as I inhaled. I wiped my nose with the back of my hand because the smell was musty. It reminded me of an attic that hadn't been opened in decades. I stepped forward, and my feet kicked up dirt that swirled around in the faint light from my flashlight. I clicked it on, aiming the beam across the floor and over some old pews. Most of them were covered in thick layers of dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners. The roof overhead looked stable enough, but there were cracks in the wood beams. I moved slowly, checking each row. I didn't see anybody. Everything felt deserted. My heart thumped against my chest and my breath was shallow. I gripped my flashlight hard, listening for any movement. Nothing. I stepped past the last row of pews toward the altar area. The floor creaked under my weight. At first, I thought it was all going to be the same, just dust and cobwebs. Then I saw something that gave me a jolt. A group of new candles lit on the altar. They weren't halfway melted or old. They looked fresh, with tall, steady flames dancing in the stale air. I stopped and stared. The altar was otherwise plain. A cloth was draped across it, covered with a light coat of dust except where the candles sat. That small area was spotless, like someone had wiped it clean. I swallowed hard. I could hear my own breathing. No one else seemed to be inside, but I felt a strange pressure in the back of my head. My ears seemed to ring a little, like they do when you're in a very quiet place. I inched closer, shining my flashlight around to see if there was any sign of recent activity. I looked for footprints in the dust. I found a few partial marks near the altar, but I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old. They were smudged, like someone brushed them away. The candles flickered. The warm glow made the area around the altar feel different from the rest of the church. The rest of the space was in shadow, dusty and cold. I felt my palms get sweaty. Part of me wanted to back off and return to my car, but another part wanted to see if there was some explanation. Maybe a caretaker had come in to light candles for some reason. But the place had been closed for years, so who would do that at this hour? I set my camera bag down on one of the pews and carefully pulled out my camera. My hands were trembling, so I took a moment to steady myself. I tried a few shots of the candles from different angles. The camera's shutter sounded too loud in that silent space. After each shot, I paused, looking around to see if anyone would react. Nothing happened. The only movement was from dust motes floating in my flashlight beam. I decided to explore more. The building wasn't huge, but there was a back area that might have been used as an office or storage. The door leading there looked old and chipped. I walked over, listening for anything behind it. Still nothing. I gently turned the knob. The door opened without resistance, and my flashlight revealed a short hallway with two smaller rooms on either side. Inside the first room, I saw broken chairs, a couple of folding tables, and stacked boxes. They were all covered in thick dust. I swept the beam of light around, noticing some old papers scattered on the floor. They looked like bulletins or old notices from services. I crouched down to glance at them, but they were damp and stuck together. They ripped when I tried to pick them up. In the second room, I found a rusted metal cabinet. One of the doors was slightly open. I pulled it gently and it squealed on its hinges. Inside, there were some glass vases, mostly cracked or dusty. A few old candle holders, but nothing that looked like it had been used recently. I closed the cabinet and stood up, my knees cracking. I felt tense. My skin prickled like something was off. I kept thinking about those lit candles in the main area. Who lit them? Why were they new? I glanced at the corners of the room, just to be sure nobody was hiding. It was empty. I went back toward the altar, stepping carefully. When I got there, I noticed that the candles seemed to have melted a little more, but the flames were still strong. I took a deep breath and spoke out loud, though softly, just to see if anyone would answer. "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed a bit. No response. The echo gave me a chill. I decided to look behind the altar. There was a small door in the wall, probably leading to a storage closet for ceremonial items. I turned the knob. It was locked. I tried to force it, but it wouldn't budge. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sounds. It was completely still. I felt my heart pounding. My shirt was damp with sweat. The church felt colder than before, but my body was tense and warm from adrenaline. I turned back to the altar and considered blowing out the candles to see if that would provoke some response. But then I hesitated. What if someone was watching from the shadows? I pointed my flashlight around the pews again, scanning each row slowly. My beam caught a shape near the last row, but it was just a tall statue covered by a sheet. I wasn't sure what statue it was, but it looked human-sized, and the white sheet gave it a strange outline. I moved closer, shining the flashlight on it. The sheet had dust on the shoulders, and the rest of it draped to the floor. It looked like it might be a statue of a saint or maybe a religious figure. I didn't pull the sheet off. I didn't want to disturb anything more than I already had, but I felt uneasy standing there in the dark next to that covered shape. My skin crawled with the idea that someone could be behind it, but I touched it and felt the solid statue underneath. I backed away and decided to check the doors on the far side of the building. One led outside, but it was locked from the inside. I slid the bolt open and pushed the door, only to find it blocked by something. It barely opened an inch. I tried again, putting my shoulder into it, but it didn't budge. It felt like a heavy piece of furniture was against it on the outside. That made no sense. I wondered if people had blocked it on purpose. I went around to the side entrance where I came in. It was still open. I stuck my head out to see if anyone was wandering around. The field was empty, and the road was quiet. My car was still there, a silhouette in the weak moonlight. No sign of anyone else. I went back inside, leaving the door ajar in case I needed to leave fast. Back in the main area, I noticed something different. The altar cloth was shifted slightly, like someone tugged at it. The candles were still there, but one was out. Smoke curled up from the recently extinguished wick. I felt a rush of blood to my face. That candle had been lit when I arrived. Now it was out, but I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anyone pass by. My legs felt weak for a moment. I spun around, shining the flashlight at every corner. I walked fast toward the altar, checking the area behind it again. Still no one. I spoke out loud, louder this time. "Hello? I'm not here to bother you. I'm just a photographer." My voice echoed. Nothing. My mind raced. I wondered if I should just leave, but I also felt drawn to figure out what was happening. I took a few more photos of the candles, capturing the strange scene. The newness of the candles bothered me. They weren't dusty at all, and they had clean labels around the base. They looked like the kind you buy at a store in town, not some antique relic. I considered the possibility of a group using the church for secret meetings or something. Maybe they left in a hurry when they heard me come in, but I hadn't heard any footsteps. The only open entrance was the side door, and that was behind me the whole time. Unless there was another exit I hadn't noticed, it seemed unlikely they slipped past me. I reached for my phone in my jacket pocket. I unlocked the screen and checked for a signal. 1 bar, maybe 2. I could make a call if I needed, but I didn't know who I would call. The police? I had no proof of anything criminal. Just an old building with some lit candles. It wasn't technically breaking and entering because the door was already broken. I felt uneasy, though. My stomach churned. The church felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in on me. I wanted more light, so I took my flashlight and propped it on a pew so it shined toward the altar. Then I rummaged through my camera bag and grabbed a small LED panel I sometimes use for low-light shots. I switched it on, brightening the space a little. With more illumination, I saw how thick the dust layer really was on the floor. My footprints were clear. I could trace my own path from the door to the altar. But off to the left, I noticed marks that weren't mine. They led from a corner behind some pews toward the altar, then stopped. The dust was disturbed in that area, but it didn't continue anywhere else. I followed those marks, shining my light. They went right up to the front pew, then vanished. I crouched down to examine the floor. It looked like someone brushed them away at that point, or they stepped onto something that didn't hold dust. I reached out and touched the floor. It felt rough and cold, like old wood with dirt ground into it. My fingertip came away gray with powder. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was a faint scraping, like something sliding across the floor in the distance. I whipped my head around, scanning the dark corners. The sound came from near the back, close to the small hallway I explored. My pulse quickened, and my face felt hot. I stood up slowly, picking up my flashlight. I took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, my footsteps cautious. My heart pounded so loud I felt it in my ears. When I reached the hallway, I aimed the beam inside. The door to the second room was shut. I left it open earlier. My throat went dry. I approached and carefully turned the knob. Locked. I pressed my ear against it and listened. At first, nothing. Then I heard a subtle shifting sound, like fabric rubbing against wood. I stepped back, adrenaline surging. My mind raced with questions about who was in there. My palms were sweaty, and the flashlight felt slippery in my hand. I felt a sudden urge to leave. I didn't want a confrontation, and I didn't want to get stuck in a weird situation. My gut told me whoever was in there didn't want company. I decided to grab my gear and go. I backed away from the hallway, my eyes fixed on that door. The scraping sound stopped. Everything was silent again. I hurried back into the main space, snatched my camera bag, and switched off my LED panel. My flashlight was my only source of light now. I glanced at the altar one last time. 3 candles still burned, and one was out. Nothing else moved. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the side door. I stepped outside into the open air, feeling a huge release of tension. The fresh breeze hit my face, and I realized I had been sweating. I turned around to look at the church facade. The broken side door hung slightly open behind me. No light came from inside. The flickering I saw earlier had stopped, probably because my flashlight and LED panel overshadowed it. I couldn't see the candles anymore from out here. The building looked empty again. The wind rustled the tall grass in the field. I stood there, my breath still shaky. I thought about going back in to see if that door in the hallway would open now, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something felt wrong about the whole place. I walked to my car, my sneakers crunching on the gravel. I opened the driver's side door and tossed my camera bag onto the passenger seat. I gave the church one more look. I felt a tightness in my stomach, like I left something unfinished. But the feeling of unease overpowered that. The sun was gone now, and only a faint glow remained in the sky. The silhouette of the church stood against it, with broken boards and missing shingles. It looked abandoned again, just like before. But I knew someone or something was inside. And that altar, with fresh candles and no dust, was proof that someone had been there recently. I climbed into the car and shut the door. The interior smelled like old upholstery. I locked the doors out of habit, then started the engine. As I pulled back onto the lonely road, my headlights swept across the front of the church. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows. But then it was gone. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving, my mind racing with questions. Who lit those candles? Why was the door in the back room locked? And what was that scraping sound? I kept looking in my rearview mirror until the church was out of sight. My body felt exhausted and my fingers were shaking on the steering wheel. I reminded myself I had photos in my camera, real proof that something strange was going on in there. But at that moment, I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to get home, lock my own door, and try to calm down. As I drove away, the field stretched on both sides, and the sky got darker. I gripped the wheel with both hands, keeping my eyes on the road. The tension in my shoulders slowly eased, but I still felt an odd pressure in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that the church wasn't truly abandoned. Someone was in there doing something secret, leaving fresh candles on a dusty altar, and I had barged in with my camera, clueless and alone. I promised myself I wouldn't go back there at night, if at all. The place was closed for a reason, and it wasn't just because people stopped coming to pray. The emptiness I had expected to find was filled by something else, and I wasn't prepared to find out what it was. I got the call on a Monday morning. The job seemed straightforward. Inspect a rundown property that had suffered partial fire damage. I was told nobody had lived there for years, and the insurance company needed a proper assessment of the remaining structures. They said the place was isolated and the house had boards on most of the windows. Right away, I felt a knot in my stomach, but I figured it was just the nerves of stepping into a creepy old farm. I had handled tough jobs before. I never expected what happened that day. I drove up a narrow dirt road for almost an hour before I saw the remains of the farmhouse. Part of the roof was missing, and one side of the building showed black scorch marks that extended up the walls. There was a lingering smell of burnt wood in the air, even though the fire had happened some time ago. The grass around the place was uneven and tall, brushing against my boots when I stepped out of my truck. I parked in a makeshift spot in the yard and walked up to the main house. I wore a thick jacket and a pair of sturdy jeans because the forecast mentioned cooler temperatures. The morning sun gave enough light to see the boarded windows and the battered siding. The boards looked nailed in a hurry with crooked nails and uneven cuts. Some corners had peeled back from exposure, leaving gaps and splinters. The front door wouldn't budge when I tried the handle. It felt solid, and I guess the frame might have warped from the heat of the fire. I circled around to see if there was another way in. The side windows were covered with the same rough boards. The backyard was a mess of fallen branches, old junk, and a collapsed shed. It didn't look like anyone had been around for a long time. Then I noticed a set of small cellar doors leading down into the basement. The doors were made of heavy, weather-beaten wood with rusty hinges. They were stuck at first, but after a hard shove, they opened with a loud creak. A cold, damp smell rose from inside. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and descended the steps. The basement was dark, with a low ceiling and a dirt floor in some areas. In others, there was a thin layer of cracked concrete. The smell of ash mixed with wet earth. I heard a drip somewhere in the corner, like water seeping through the old stone foundation. My boots kicked up dust that glowed in the beam of my flashlight. I saw charred beams overhead where the fire had burned through the floor above. There was a broken table pushed up against the wall and a few scattered chairs. My flashlight's beam revealed black smudges on the concrete foundation walls. They looked like remnants of the smoke that had soaked into the place. I moved carefully, not wanting to stumble on any debris or hidden nails. My heart beat a little faster than usual. I chalked it up to the eerie setting. I told myself it was just another job site, just another burned building. I wanted to see if there was any structural damage to the foundation, so I walked the perimeter. Some sections had cracks, but nothing that looked too dangerous at first glance. I kept the flashlight aimed low, checking for holes or loose boards that might trip me up. Toward the far side of the basement, I found a wooden staircase leading up. It looked worn with some steps missing or split. I tapped the first step with my boot and felt it wobble. I pressed a bit of weight on it, and it seemed like it would hold for a quick climb. So I started up, one step at a time, placing my foot near the edge to avoid rotted parts. The stairs creaked loudly, and each sound echoed in the basement. When I got to the door at the top, I tried the handle. It turned, but the door wouldn't open. It felt like something heavy was pressed against it from the other side. I leaned in with my shoulder and pushed. Nothing. I tried to shove harder, but it wouldn't give an inch. My pulse sped up, and a nervous sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I was alone in that basement, and I didn't like the idea that I might be stuck there. I took a moment to catch my breath and think. Then I heard a noise above me. It sounded like wood scraping against the floor. My stomach tightened. I listened more carefully, holding my breath to keep quiet. There it was again, an unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged. I felt my heart pound in my chest. I knew nobody was supposed to be living here. The place had been abandoned for years, at least according to my files. Yet I couldn't deny the noise. It was right above me, near the door. I knocked on the door and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded shaky and too loud in my own ears. I waited. Nothing but silence. No footsteps, no response. Then another scrape, like a piece of furniture moving across the floor. A chill ran through my arms and down my legs. It felt unnatural. I tried to keep calm by telling myself it could be the wind. Maybe the structure was weak and something was shifting, but the scraping noise had a deliberate rhythm. It didn't sound random. I knocked again, a bit harder. "I'm stuck down here," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "If someone's up there, please move whatever's blocking the door." No reply came. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence stretched for what felt like a full minute. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then the scraping sound happened again. It was slow, like someone pushing a table inch by inch. I felt a rush of panic. My breathing grew shallow, and my fingers gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles hurt. I tried to control my breathing and think logically. If someone was up there, they'd heard me. Maybe they didn't want me to come in, or maybe they were scared themselves. I banged on the door with the side of my fist. The sound of my pounding echoed, but there was no answer. I considered kicking the door, but it felt too solid and I didn't want to break my foot. I decided to head back down the stairs and see if there was another route out of the basement. At the bottom of the steps, I shone my flashlight around the walls, looking for a window or some opening that wasn't boarded up. The cellar windows were small and placed high near the ceiling, close to the ground level outside. Most were covered with old boards or had thick cobwebs across them. I tried pulling on one of the boards, but the nails held firm, and I didn't have a crowbar with me. My breathing got heavier. I felt a wave of frustration and fear. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. No signal. That didn't surprise me, given the remote location and the basement walls. I tried anyway, pacing around, raising the phone to see if I could get a single bar. Nothing. I stepped on a piece of debris and it snapped under my boot. The sound made me jump and my heart thudded again. I forced myself to calm down and think step by step. I saw an old metal shelf against one wall, covered in dust and soot. I searched it for anything useful, tools, maybe a crowbar or a pry bar. I found a rusty hammer with a broken handle, a box of nails, and some scrap metal pieces. It wasn't much. I took the hammer anyway. The head was still solid, even though the handle was split. I returned to the staircase, determined to try the door again. I banged with the hammer on the door, hoping to scare off whoever was there or maybe force them to open it. The banging echoed in the dark. My arms were trembling a bit from the adrenaline, and sweat trickled down my temple. After a few hits, I stopped and listened. Nothing. I pressed my ear to the door again. Total silence. I tried to wedge the hammer's claw under the door to see if I could pry it, but the gap was too narrow. I leaned my shoulder against the door and felt it shift slightly, but it was still blocked by something heavy. My throat felt dry. I wanted water, but I hadn't brought any down with me. My bag was still in the truck. I cursed under my breath for not being more prepared. I stepped back down into the basement, trying to figure out what that scraping sound could have been. It crossed my mind that maybe some vagrants or squatters had taken shelter upstairs. But who would block the door and not answer me? That part felt wrong. I decided to see if there was any other interior passage or a crawl space that led up. Sometimes old houses have hidden corners or old coal chutes. I checked along the walls again, shining the flashlight carefully. I tapped on the stone in different spots to see if there were hollow areas. The basement was big, with small rooms partitioned by old wooden beams. One of those rooms held a large furnace that looked ancient. Another had a few rotted boxes. I opened one box and found dusty blankets, no tools. I headed back toward the old broken table. It looked like it had collapsed under its own weight sometime in the past. There were nails sticking out of the splintered top. I thought about using a piece of that wood to pry off one of the cellar window boards. I grabbed the biggest piece of wood I could find and tested its strength. It was cracked but still felt somewhat solid. My plan was to wedge it under the boards on the nearest window and try to pop at least one free. That would get me outside if I could manage to crawl through. I moved to the nearest cellar window. The board was old with rusty nails. I slid my improvised lever under the edge and pushed. My arms strained, and the board creaked, but it stayed in place. I pressed harder. A nail popped with a sharp squeak, and the board shifted. Encouraged, I took a deep breath and gave another big push. The board snapped, leaving half of it still nailed to the frame. I set the broken piece of wood aside and used the hammer to tap at the remaining nails. After several tries, the entire board fell away. Daylight trickled in along with a bit of fresh air. The window glass itself was filthy but unbroken. I tried to open it, but it was stuck in the frame. I chipped away some paint around the edges and slid the hammer claw under. The glass rattled a little. I pried gently, not wanting to smash the pane. Eventually it gave a few inches. Then I worked the other side until it opened enough for me to fit my arm through. I tested the gap with my shoulders. It would be tight, but I thought I might squeeze through. Before I tried crawling out, I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I realized I hadn't heard the scraping sound for a while, but the silence upstairs felt heavy. I stood there looking at the partially open window. My heart pounded as I wondered if I should attempt to push the window wider or go back to the door. Then I remembered how solid that door felt. I told myself I was wasting time thinking about it. My best shot was to crawl through the window. I slid my flashlight into my jacket pocket so I could have both hands free. I pushed the window up as far as it would go. I placed the hammer on the windowsill, then hoisted myself. My shoulders bumped the sill and dust fell in my face. I coughed but kept going. I twisted my body to an angle, then pulled with my arms and kicked my legs. My chest scraped against the frame and my jacket got snagged. I felt a moment of panic, worrying I might get stuck halfway. After a few tries, I managed to pull free, landing on the grass outside with a thud. I sat there, panting, my hands shaking. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking near the cellar doors, but everything was still. The air felt cooler than before, and the sky looked slightly overcast. I picked myself up and brushed off my jeans. My heart was still racing, and I could feel sweat cooling on my back. I stared at the house and wondered who, or what, had blocked that door. I walked around to the front yard again, scanning the windows. They were all still boarded. Nothing moved. I decided not to go back inside. I had what I needed to file a basic report: partial roof collapse, fire damage, questionable structural integrity, and an inaccessible ground floor. I also had a strange experience that I couldn't fully explain. My mouth felt dry and my legs were a bit wobbly as I headed to my truck. I opened the door, tossed my flashlight and the hammer on the passenger seat, and sat there, catching my breath. I started the engine and glanced at the house one last time. The boards on the windows remained still and the yard was quiet. I thought about the scraping noise in the basement and the blocked door. I thought about how someone might have been up there, moving furniture, listening to me pound on the wood. I put the truck into gear and headed down the dirt road. I didn't see any signs of other vehicles or fresh tire tracks. The insurance company could send someone else to do a more detailed inspection. I had no intention of returning. The entire drive back, I felt my hands grip the steering wheel too hard, and my foot pressed on the gas pedal a little heavier than usual. My heart was still thumping by the time I got onto the main highway. I didn't call anyone right away. I just drove, letting the road roll under the tires. My mind replayed every moment of that basement. The locked door, the scraping, the final climb out through the window. I kept telling myself that there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe old furniture just shifted from the wind or the floor was unbalanced. But it didn't feel that way when it happened. It felt deliberate. It felt like someone was pushing something against the door so I couldn't get out. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, typing up my notes for the report. My shoulders were tense and I couldn't focus on the usual data about square footage or damage estimates. Instead, I kept remembering the heavy scrape of wood against wood. I kept seeing the boarded windows in my mind. I never heard another human voice in that house, but I heard that noise. I decided to leave that part out of the official report. Nobody would believe me, and it wouldn't change the evaluation. The place was unlivable and dangerous. By the time I finished, it was late. I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. My hands trembled a little as I lay in bed, thinking about how I felt trapped under that old house. I was safe now, far from that basement, but my pulse still quickened every time I remembered the thud of something blocking that door. I told myself it was over, I had made it out. No one had gotten hurt, and nothing had followed me home. That should have brought relief, but it didn't. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat, wishing I'd never gone to that farmhouse alone. I parked my car on the uneven shoulder of a narrow back road. The place looked deserted. My contact had said this was a hidden gem, but all I saw was a huge, decaying house surrounded by tangled weeds. The paint on the front walls had peeled away, and the wood on the porch was warped and rotting in places. I stepped out of my car, stared at the property, and wondered if anyone had taken care of it in the last 10 years. The yard felt like a jungle, with tall grass up to my knees. I took a deep breath, tasting the damp air, and walked toward the front door. I'm an architect. People call me when a building is on its last legs, and they want a professional opinion on whether it's worth saving. Usually, I like the challenge. Old buildings can hide great potential, but this place had a weird pull from the moment I saw it. The driveway was full of cracks, and parts of it were swallowed by the dirt. My steps felt uncertain. I kicked a few loose stones, and they rattled against the porch. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. It still stood, but the wood looked splintered along the edges. I tried to push it open, and it moved with a scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard. Inside, the air was stale. Dust floated in the beams of light that slipped through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. There was a wide foyer with a chandelier overhead, but the chandelier's crystals were coated in grime. A few broken light bulbs dangled from the fixture, and one of them clinked against the metal as the door's movement sent a small draft through the entryway. I paused for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim space. My shoes squeaked against the floorboards, which were scattered with debris, small leaves, bits of plaster, and layers of dust that my footsteps disturbed. I ran my hand along the wall and felt chipped paint flaking off under my fingers. Ahead of me was what looked like a living room. The doorway had a tall arch typical of old manor houses. I looked in and saw sheets thrown over furniture, but they were so old that the cloth had turned gray. The room smelled like a mixture of mold and something old and forgotten, almost like a closet that hasn't been opened for years. Each breath felt heavy in my chest. The silence weighed on me. Even outside, the wind seemed to have died down. I took a step into the living room and dust flew up around my ankles. The floor didn't seem to sag, which I took as a good sign for the foundation, but I made a mental note to check the beams later. I pulled the sheet off the nearest piece of furniture. It was a wooden coffee table with short legs, polished once but now dull with scratches. I ran my finger across the surface and collected a thick coat of dust. I wiped it on my pants. On the fireplace mantel there were family photographs in simple frames. The glass was smeared and cloudy, but I saw faces staring back at me. I didn't recognize them. A man in a suit, a woman in a dress, and a couple of other relatives lined up for a formal picture. The frame next to it had what looked like the same family on a vacation, but the details were hard to see through the dirt on the glass. My stomach felt uneasy. I was standing in someone else's memories, and it felt personal even though the house was clearly abandoned. In the corner of the living room, propped against a wall, was a small bicycle. Its paint was chipped, and the tires were flat. The metal parts had a thin layer of rust. It looked like someone had left it there, planning to come back and ride it later. But it never moved. I looked away. The rest of the living room had a couple of armchairs facing an old TV set. The TV screen was covered with a sheet, and a thick cord snaked behind it, unplugged. A few cardboard boxes sat stacked against another wall, all sealed with yellowed tape. I heard a low creaking sound from above me. I stopped moving and listened. It sounded like floorboards flexing, maybe on the second floor, or possibly the wind pushing against loose rafters. I waited, but I didn't hear it again. I checked the structure of the walls in the living room, tapping gently to see if there was any hollow echo that might indicate severe damage. It all felt solid enough, though I suspected some water damage near the windows. The paint was blistered, and the windowsills had black discoloration like mold. I made a note on my phone. Then I walked back through the foyer toward what I assumed was the dining room. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, a long table with 6 chairs stood covered in dust. A china cabinet stood in the corner, glass doors intact but foggy. I opened one of the doors. Inside, I found porcelain plates stacked neatly and a couple of small figurines. One plate had chipped edges, the other looked new. I wondered why they were left behind. The house had that unsettling stillness where every movement felt louder than it should. My footsteps and breathing seemed magnified in the silence. My heart rate picked up every time I heard a new noise. The wind outside caused loose window frames to rattle occasionally, and each time, I felt a spike of adrenaline. There was a sense that I was intruding. I tried to shrug off the feeling. I was here for work, not to scare myself. I checked another door in the dining room and found the kitchen. Light filtered through a single window at the back. The rest were boarded up. The counters were still intact, though the surfaces were covered in thick dust and some kind of residue, maybe grease that had never been cleaned. I saw an old stove, a sink filled with brownish stains, and a row of cabinets. One cabinet door was missing, and the rest looked fragile. A sudden drip of water made me jump. I spun around and saw a small puddle forming under the sink. I approached and carefully opened the cabinet below it. The pipe had a crack, and water was seeping through. I turned the faucet handle to see if it was on, but no water came out. Whatever source was in play, it was minimal. Maybe a leftover from the house's old plumbing system or a partially open valve somewhere. I shined the flashlight from my phone into the dark space under the sink and cringed at the spider webs. A big spider crawled away from the light. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse in my throat. I wasn't a fan of crawling things in tight spaces. I backed out of the kitchen and returned to the foyer. An old staircase led to the second floor. The banister was thick wood, carved in a decorative pattern that had probably been stunning at one time. Now it was coated in dust. I tested the first step with my foot. It creaked, but it held my weight. One step at a time, I went up. My breathing felt shallow, and each step groaned under me. I reached the top, where I faced a long hallway. There were doors on either side, some closed, some slightly open. The hallway was dark, so I kept my phone flashlight on, though its beam was weak. I wished I had brought a stronger flashlight, but I hadn't expected total darkness in the middle of the day. I tried the first door on the left. It opened into a bedroom. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin enough to let in a little light. An unmade bed stood in the center, sheets bunched up and discolored from age. A dresser stood against the wall, and on top of it was a mirror. The reflection was cloudy. I saw my own vague shape in the center, but the corners were blackened. I walked closer and opened the top drawer. It was empty except for a few stray pieces of paper that looked like receipts. They were so faded I couldn't read them. The air smelled stale, like old clothes that had never been washed. It made me cough a little. I covered my mouth with my sleeve to block the dust. A muffled clanking noise came from somewhere else in the house. My entire body tensed. I felt a rush of heat up my neck. My grip on my phone tightened. I stayed still, listening, but everything went silent again. I waited a few seconds, then decided to check the other rooms. The next door on the same side of the hall opened into a smaller bedroom. It had a single bed frame without a mattress, a nightstand, and a small closet. The floor looked damp near the wall, suggesting a leak in the roof. Water had discolored the wallpaper in a large patch. I used my phone to take photos, making sure I documented every potential repair. My job was to figure out if the cost of fixing everything would be worth it. I moved on to a door at the end of the hallway that was closed tight. The doorknob felt cold and stuck at first, but after I jiggled it a bit, it gave way. This room appeared to be a study. Shelves lined the walls filled with old books. A desk sat in front of a window. The window was covered with thick wooden planks from the outside, so the only light came from my phone. The smell here was dense. It reminded me of old libraries, mixed with mold. The leather on the chair behind the desk was cracked. On the desk there were a few open books and a small stack of letters. I picked up the top letter, but the writing was smudged. I saw a date in the corner that looked like it was from decades ago, My skin prickled at the thought of how long this place had been left to rot. After a while, I felt a growing need to get fresh air. The quietness of the house was messing with my nerves. I also realized the temperature was dropping. The place had no heat and the late afternoon sun was getting low. I left the study and headed back down the hallway. As I passed the stairs, I glanced down and noticed a slight movement by the living room doorway. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, focusing my eyes to see better. It might have been a reflection or a shifting shadow. After a second, I saw nothing else. My hand trembled against the banister. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light or my imagination. The tension in my muscles didn't ease, though. I forced myself to move down the stairs, each step squeaking in protest. I reached the foyer and paused. The front door was still ajar, letting in a bit of pale light. I could see my car through the opening. I took a few quick steps and stepped outside. The cool evening air hit my face and I breathed in deeply. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat I hadn't noticed before. I glanced around the overgrown yard, checking for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just a breeze rustling the tall grass. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. My shoulders felt tight and my pulse was fast. I walked back to my car to grab a bottled water. I drained it in a few swallows, the cool liquid soothing my dry throat. I turned around to face the mansion again. The structure was huge, probably 3 stories if you counted the attic. The roof had missing shingles, and parts of the facade were crumbling. I needed to finish my evaluation before dark. I wasn't keen on staying there past sunset. I took out my phone and reviewed the photos I'd taken. I had enough to note serious repairs: roofing, plumbing, windows, mold treatment, and structural reinforcements. It would be expensive, but maybe not impossible. It depended on how much money the owner wanted to pour into this project. I decided to check around the outside of the house before leaving. I walked along the perimeter, pushing through the tall weeds. My jeans got snagged on briars and I had to tug free a couple of times. Near the back of the house, I found a door leading into what looked like a cellar. It had a heavy padlock, but the lock was rusted. I made a mental note about potential basement access. Then I noticed a small pile of tools near an old shed: a shovel, a rusted rake, and a couple of empty paint cans. They looked abandoned. The shed door was off its hinges, lying on the ground. I peeked inside. It was dark, but I saw some broken shelves and a few spider webs. No reason to explore further. The sun was almost gone now, and the temperature dropped fast. I shivered and decided I had enough information for a preliminary report. I walked back toward the front yard, my eyes scanning the windows as I passed. I saw my own reflection in one of the shattered panes. My heart thudded when I thought I saw another shape behind me, but I spun around and saw only the yard. I exhaled and rubbed my forehead, feeling a dull ache creeping in. I was probably spooking myself more than necessary. Reaching my car, I leaned against it for a moment, checking my phone battery. It was low. I scribbled down a few extra notes on a small pad I keep in my glove compartment. Roof repairs, interior plumbing, possible mold, foundation check. Then I looked up at the mansion one last time. The broken windows looked like dark holes against the old stone walls. The porch sagged on the right side and the tall grass rippled in the wind. Somewhere inside, a child's bicycle sat collecting dust in a silent living room. The family pictures remained on the mantel, untouched for who knew how long. Everything seemed frozen in time. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and turned on the headlights. The beams lit up the driveway and part of the porch. The wheels crunched over broken gravel as I pulled away. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out, trying to calm the tension. I thought about the cost of restoration. I thought about the possible hazards, the mold, the water damage, the structural issues. Was it worth it? I didn't have the final answer yet, but I knew I'd be back with a team of inspectors if the owner decided to move forward. The job was my responsibility. Still, a part of me wanted to recommend demolition. The place felt like it was filled with ghosts of the past, though I never saw anyone. As I drove down the empty road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion's silhouette disappeared behind the trees. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, my mind racing with all the details I'd have to include in my report. But I also felt relief. My heart rate slowed to a normal pace. The tension in my shoulders eased. The sense of being watched lifted the farther I got from that house. I focused on the next steps, contacting the contractor, arranging an official inspection, and explaining my findings. I told myself it was just an old building with some spooky atmosphere. I tried to push away the images of dusty furniture, family photos, and that small bike leaning against the wall. It was just another job, I repeated in my head. But a knot of unease sat in my stomach. I kept looking at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something dart across the road behind me, but I saw only darkness. Eventually, I turned onto a busier road, where streetlights and passing cars helped me feel less alone. My phone buzzed with a message, likely from the client, asking about my progress. I didn't answer. I needed time to think. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and dropped onto my couch. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, like I'd been on high alert for hours. My clothes still smelled like dust and mold. I set my phone to charge and went to take a shower. The hot water felt good on my skin, washing off the grime and the lingering anxiety. Afterward, I dried off and stared at my face in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired. My eyes were bloodshot, and my hair was damp and messy. I felt a slight throbbing in my temple, but it wasn't too bad. I pulled on some clean clothes and sat down with my laptop. I began typing up my notes: structural integrity, roof condition, plumbing issues, probable mold infestation, possible insect or rodent problems. My stomach growled, but the idea of food didn't appeal to me. I kept remembering the silence in that house, the dusty sheets over the furniture and the photographs on the mantel. I glanced at my phone. No more messages from the client. I shut my laptop and rubbed my eyes, deciding I could finish the report in the morning. I turned off the lights in my living room, then hesitated at the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A car passed now and then. I felt safe at home, yet a bit unsettled by the day's experience. I crawled into bed and tried to clear my mind, but I kept seeing images of that bicycle in those pictures. They seemed out of place in an empty house. I stared at the ceiling until I drifted off. I wished I could shake that feeling of intrusion, like I'd stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. But it was just a job, and soon it would be a construction project or a demolition plan. Either way, that old mansion wouldn't stay hidden forever. I arrived at that property with a knot in my stomach. The listing said it was a large rural lot with old buildings. My boss told me it used to be a religious retreat, but he didn't have many details. I took the assignment because nobody else wanted to drive that far. The trip took longer than I planned, and I reached the entrance well after sundown. I don't like arriving at unknown places at night, but I didn't want to waste another day. My gas tank was almost empty, and my eyes felt heavy from the long drive. Still, I got out of the car and walked past a rusted gate. A sense of unease hit me as soon as I stepped onto the property. The dirt path stretched forward in a narrow strip. Weeds poked through cracks in the ground. My flashlight beam bobbed up and down as I moved. The air felt cold and damp. I heard the distant sound of crickets. My legs felt stiff from hours behind the wheel, so I tried to stretch while I walked. My breath came out in short puffs. I told myself I just needed a quick look around, maybe snap a few pictures. Then I'd get out of there. A few minutes later, I noticed something odd. The property had multiple small houses arranged in a circle. They looked old and neglected. Some had broken windows. Others had doors that hung off their hinges. The paint was peeling on every one of them. I saw a chapel in the center of the circle. It had a simple wooden cross on top of a small steeple. The building itself was plain, with white walls that looked gray under the moonlight. I felt a chill run through me. There was no obvious light coming from inside. No lamps, no electric bulbs. Everything was dark. I stopped to take a closer look at the chapel's doorway. It was a single wooden door. I tried the handle, but it was locked or stuck. I heard a creaking sound behind me, so I whipped around. I didn't see anyone at first. I just saw shapes of buildings and the outlines of a few low trees near the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded. I held my flashlight higher, scanning around me in a slow circle. That's when I caught sight of someone standing in the shadow by one of the houses. The figure stood motionless, half hidden behind a corner. I couldn't see a face. I just saw a dark outline and a faint reflection in the eyes when my flashlight passed over. I cleared my throat and tried to speak, but the words stuck. I felt sweat on my forehead, even though it was cold. I forced myself to call out, "Hello?" I paused, expecting some response. I got nothing. The figure shifted slightly, and then I heard a low sound, almost like a shuffle on the ground. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or the person's foot. I told myself maybe it was a caretaker or someone who stayed behind to watch the place. My boss mentioned the retreat had been closed for a while, but sometimes these places have squatters or holdouts who never left. I tried to look calm. "I'm from the city," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm here to check the property. I'm a real estate agent. I'm just doing my job." No answer. The figure took a step back, disappearing behind the building. I took a deep breath and considered my options. Part of me wanted to jump back in the car and drive off. Another part of me felt a responsibility to do what I'd come to do. I figured I'd at least try to look around the chapel. Maybe I could see enough from the outside. My shoulders were tense and my legs felt tight, but I forced them to move. I walked around the chapel's perimeter. The siding had cracks. The windows were small, and I noticed thick dust on the panes. I stepped on broken gravel. My flashlight lit a short walkway that led to a side entrance. A loose piece of wood scraped against the wall. I smelled damp air mixed with a stale odor, like moldy papers or old cloth. I heard my own breathing, shallow and fast. Then I caught movement near the ring of houses. Another figure appeared, then a second, then a third. They stood in the open areas between the houses like they were waiting. I could see them more clearly this time. They wore plain dark clothes. Some had long sleeves, some wore jackets. No one made a sound. The nearest person was maybe 15 yards away. I spotted short, scruffy hair on one man. Another looked older with a thin frame. They all stared at me. I felt my hands start to shake. I raised my voice again. "I'm not here to bother anyone. I just need to look at the property. Then I'll leave." The group didn't respond. Nobody nodded or waved. They just stood there, watching. I tried to angle my flashlight away from their faces because I didn't want to provoke them. I heard my pulse in my ears. I began to wonder if they were part of some group that never left the retreat. I didn't see any sign of normal living, though. No lights, no vehicles, no sign of a generator or anything like that. It looked abandoned. I knew I had to keep it together. I took a few steps toward the path that led back to my car. That's when one of them moved closer, closing the distance by a few yards. Then another figure copied him. They advanced in short increments. I stopped. The hair on my arm stood up. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. My flashlight trembled in my grip. "Look," I said, my voice quivering. "I'll leave right now if you want." They said nothing. They spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around me, but they were still a few yards away. I felt trapped between the chapel and those people. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard and decided to move toward the gap between two of them. I figured if they wanted to stop me, they would, but I couldn't just stand there. As soon as I took one step, they took one step. It wasn't a coordinated march, but it felt like they were mirroring my movements. My heart pounded against my ribs. I kept thinking about how I had no phone signal. I'd checked earlier, and there were no bars. Even if I tried to call for help, I doubted it would go through. My car was parked outside the gate. It wasn't too far, but it felt like a mile away. I remembered the gate was just a few hundred feet back, near the entrance. Maybe I could sprint there, but I had no idea if these people would chase me. I forced myself to speak again. "I'll just go." My voice cracked. Nobody replied. They took another step toward me. Now they were close enough for me to see their faces under the faint moonlight. Their expressions were blank, but their eyes looked wide and unblinking. One man's jaw was tense and his lips parted like he was breathing through his mouth. A woman to his left had her head tilted slightly as if she was trying to get a better look at me. I felt a spike of panic. My hands tingled from the rush of blood, and I felt a trembling in my knees. I turned and walked fast in the direction of the gate, keeping my eyes on them as best I could. They moved too, matching my speed. I wanted to run, but I was afraid that if I ran, they'd chase me. My stomach churned. I reached the spot where the dirt path met the main clearing. I could see the fence line ahead. The rusted gate was open. My car was just beyond it, a dark shape against the night. I felt a slight sense of relief. I glanced back. They were still coming, closing the gap. I heard the crunch of dirt and gravel under our feet. My heart was hammering so hard that it felt like a drum in my chest. My eyes locked on the car. I kept walking. My flashlight bounced. My breath came in gasps. I felt the cold air hitting my lungs. Behind me, I heard shuffling steps and maybe a mutter or two, but no clear words. I just sensed their presence getting closer. My adrenaline spiked again, and I broke into a run. I didn't care anymore about provoking them. I bolted toward the gate, arms pumping, flashlight beam shaking violently. I glanced back once while running. They were running too, or at least moving fast enough that I saw them covering ground. My chest burned from the sudden sprint, and I pushed myself harder. The gate was old and one hinge was broken, so it hung crooked. I slammed into it with my shoulder, shoving it aside. My car was right there. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them on the ground. My hand was slick with sweat. I managed to unlock the door and yank it open. I threw myself behind the wheel and jammed the key into the ignition. My door was still open when I turned the engine over. I heard it roar to life, and I slammed the door shut. As I did, I saw several figures appear at the edge of the gate. I couldn't tell if it was the same group or if there were more of them. I didn't stop to count. I put the car in drive and hit the gas. The tires spun on loose gravel before catching. The car lurched forward. As I sped away, I fought the urge to keep looking in the rearview mirror. I managed a quick glance and saw a couple of silhouettes standing in the path, fading into darkness as I got farther away. My entire body was shaking. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. My breath came out in ragged bursts. A few minutes later, I hit a paved road. The tension in my shoulders didn't vanish, but I felt some relief knowing I was on a public highway. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting a set of headlights to appear behind me. I didn't see anything. My face felt hot, and I noticed I was breathing through my mouth. My mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. I wondered if they were some sect that still occupied that land. I wondered why they never spoke. I just kept driving. My gas gauge was low, and I wasn't sure if there was a station close by. I decided to keep going until I found a town or any place with lights. After a few miles, I found a small diner that was still open. It looked run down, but there were a couple of trucks parked out front. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat there staring at the dash. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I debated going inside to call someone, but it was late, and I didn't even know who to call. The local police, my boss? I didn't have an exact address for the property. I only had coordinates and some brief notes. I took out my phone. No signal. I felt a headache coming on, so I rubbed my temples and tried to calm down. Eventually, I forced myself to exit the car. The cold night air hit me again. I walked into the diner. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the place smelled like old frying oil. A tired-looking woman behind the counter asked me if I wanted a seat. I told her I'd just like some coffee. She poured a cup, and I noticed my hands were unsteady as I lifted it. I didn't say much. I just stared at the liquid and tried to slow my breathing. I played the scene over in my head again and again. Those people were real. They stared at me and approached me without a word. I wondered if they were trespassers or if they considered me the trespasser. Maybe that was their land. Maybe they didn't want anyone else there. I had a lot of questions, but I was in no mood to drive back and ask them. I sat in that diner for about an hour. I finished my coffee and asked for a refill. I tried to think of how I would explain all of this to my boss. There weren't any photos to show besides a few pictures of the chapel's exterior I'd managed to take, but I doubted that would capture the unease. I felt too shaky to go through the photos right then. Eventually I got up, paid for the coffee, and went back to the car. My head was buzzing with a mix of adrenaline and exhaustion. I was out of breath from just walking back across the parking lot. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. I started the engine. Part of me considered sleeping in the diner's lot until morning, but I didn't want to stick around any longer. I wanted to put distance between myself and that property. So I drove. I kept going until I reached a small motel on the outskirts of another town. I checked in, not caring about the condition of the room. I just needed a bed and a lock on the door. I dragged my bag from the trunk. Inside the motel room, I locked the door and put the chain on. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the clock on the nightstand. It was past midnight. My mind kept replaying every detail. The shape of those houses, the look of that chapel, and the silent stares of those people. I didn't feel safe until I pulled the curtain shut and checked the lock again. Then I took a quick shower. The hot water helped calm me a bit, but I still felt my heart skip whenever I thought I heard a noise outside. I dried off, got dressed, and lay on top of the bed. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured dark shapes closing in, stepping out of those old houses and circling me. The next morning, I tried to call my boss from the motel phone. He picked up, and I told him I wouldn't be finishing that assignment. I gave him a summary of what happened. He was confused, but didn't push too hard for details. I said I'd email him everything later. My plan was to drive home and never go back there. If anyone wants to buy that property, they can visit it themselves in daylight with a group of people. I wanted no part of it. I didn't see those silent watchers after that night. I didn't want to. All I know is that I walked onto that land expecting an empty retreat and found something else. Those people had no interest in talking. They just stood there, staring, and they seemed ready to run me off if I stayed any longer. I won't forget the way they moved or how the property felt under the moonlight. I'm done with that place. If someone else wants to close that deal, they can handle it. I'm not stepping foot in that circle of houses again. That's all I have to say about it. I first heard about the old manor from a local historian. He told me it used to produce wine until the 70s. He said the place was abandoned, and people in town whispered about strange noises at night. I make regional documentaries, so I figured I'd check it out. I didn't expect to find anyone living there. I didn't expect to feel uneasy in those empty rooms. But from the moment I set foot inside, I sensed something was off. The hallways were silent, but I kept catching little signs that I wasn't alone. That's when I discovered the new supermarket bags and the cookie wrappers in the attic. That's when I realized someone else might be hiding in that house. I arrived at the front gate early in the morning. The sky was clear and the air felt a bit cold. I parked my old van on a small gravel patch near the front steps. The manor stood in front of me with chipped paint and vines crawling up the walls. The windows were dark and the wooden door looked sturdy, though it had cracks along the edges. I pulled on the door and it opened with a creak that made me swallow hard. I stepped inside with my camera equipment on my back and a flashlight in my hand. The entrance hall was large and empty. The floorboards squeaked under my boots and dust drifted in the sunlight coming through the broken windows. A few furniture pieces were scattered around, covered in sheets. I could see an old chandelier above me, missing half its crystals. I heard my own breathing echo as I stood there, getting a feel for the place. I walked deeper into the manor, filming everything. The main hallway led to what seemed like a parlor on the left and a large room on the right. I peeked into the parlor. It had a fireplace with a cracked mantel. A faded rug covered part of the floor. I saw a few bottles, maybe leftover wine bottles, but they were empty and covered in dust. I started setting up my tripod to get a wide shot. My plan was to capture each room, then record a voiceover later. As I got my camera positioned, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. I glanced at the open doorway behind me. Nothing was there. I kept filming. After I got what I needed in the parlor, I moved to the room across the hall. It was huge, with high ceilings and tall windows that overlooked the vineyard. Actually, the vineyard was just overgrown weeds by now, but I could still see the old rows where vines once grew. There were large oak barrels along one wall, some tipped over, some still upright. I ran my hand over one barrel and the wood felt brittle. I noticed a thin layer of grime on my palm afterward. The air smelled musty, mixed with something stale, maybe old wine residue or mold. In the corner, there was a door that led down to what might have been a cellar. I decided to check the upper floors first before heading downstairs. So I walked back into the main hall, found a grand staircase, and made my way up. The steps groaned, and the handrail felt loose. Once I reached the landing, I saw a corridor with rooms on each side. I filmed as I walked. Each room looked similar: dusty floors, peeling wallpaper, and old furniture. I opened one door and found a bedroom with a mattress on the floor. The mattress had a huge stain in the center. I grimaced and turned away. I didn't plan to spend much time in these rooms. They were mostly empty, and I wanted footage of the more interesting areas, like the attic. So I looked for a way to the attic. At the end of the corridor, I spotted a small door in the ceiling with a pull-down ladder. I tugged on it and the ladder creaked as it unfolded. I took a deep breath and climbed up. The attic was dark, so I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through thick dust in the air. At first, I saw old trunks and a few crates. Cobwebs hung off the rafters. I set my camera on top of a trunk, hoping to capture the wide view. Then my flashlight revealed something strange in a corner. A few plastic grocery bags, the kind you'd get at a modern supermarket. They looked new. They weren't discolored or dusty. I walked closer and saw cookie packaging and empty water bottles. I even saw a jacket hanging from a nail in the wall. I felt my stomach twist. I stood there trying to make sense of it. Someone must have been in here recently. The packaging had bright colors, so it couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, maybe days. The water bottles had labels from a local store. I crouched and felt the inside of one bag. There were crumbs of crackers or cookies left. I heard a noise behind me like a soft scratch. I whipped around and pointed my flashlight. I saw nothing except a few shadows. My heart thumped hard. I scanned the attic again, stepping around carefully. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. I walked back to my camera and flipped off the recording for a moment, trying to keep quiet. My breathing sounded loud in the stillness. I decided to keep the camera rolling, just in case. I wanted to document every detail. I moved the beam of my flashlight across the rafters, the floor, and the far side of the attic. I noticed footprints in the dust, leading to a small window. They looked newer than the rest of the clutter. My pulse quickened and my thoughts raced. I wondered if I should call out. I wondered if I should just leave. But I've been in abandoned places before, and sometimes people squat in them. They're usually harmless, just folks who need a place to stay. Still, I felt uneasy. The manor was big, and I didn't know if there was only one person. I stayed quiet. I finished getting the shots I needed up in the attic. I filmed the plastic bags, the wrappers, the jacket, and the footprints. Then I backed away. I wanted to see if there were any other signs of recent habitation in the manor. I climbed down the ladder and returned to the second floor. The corridor was silent. I noticed my hands felt cold and a little shaky. The air felt thicker than before. I walked back toward the stairs. Each step made a dull thump. I kept my flashlight on, even though some light came in through the windows. I reached the main floor and heard a faint rustling sound. It seemed to come from somewhere near the large storage room I'd visited earlier. I turned my head toward that direction. My heart pounded. I moved slowly, holding my breath. The door to that big room was still open. I peeked inside. The oak barrels were there, the same arrangement as before. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight. I didn't see a person, but I smelled something like stale sweat. That wasn't there earlier, or at least I hadn't noticed it. I took a step inside. Hello? I said in a low voice. My voice sounded rough. I waited. No answer. I moved the flashlight beam around, checking behind the barrels and in the corners. Nothing. But the sense of being watched crept back. My heart thumped again and my palms were damp. I thought about leaving, but part of me wanted to capture more evidence. I'm not usually jumpy, but the discovery in the attic had me on edge. I decided to check the cellar after all. There might be signs that someone had broken in from a back entrance. I found the door that led downstairs. It was made of old wood with rusted hinges. I pulled it open, and the smell of damp air hit me. The staircase was narrow. I shined the flashlight down. I could see a stone floor at the bottom. I stepped slowly, leaning against the wall for balance. My camera bag bumped my hip with each step. The cellar was darker than the rest of the house, and it felt colder. At the bottom, I saw rows of wine racks. Most were empty, but a few still held dusty bottles. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but it was dead. I only had my flashlight. Water dripped from the walls. The sound echoed softly. I noticed there was a second chamber in the back, so I headed there. My footsteps were steady, but my breath got faster. The air smelled stale, like old stone and moldy wood. When I reached the second chamber, I noticed something that looked like a makeshift sleeping area. There were a few blankets spread on the ground. They weren't ancient blankets. They looked worn, but not from the 70s. There was a small pile of items. A flashlight, some unopened packages of snack food, and a couple of half-filled water bottles. I crouched down and touched one of the blankets. It was slightly warm. My chest tightened. That meant someone had been here recently, maybe minutes ago. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. My skin tingled and my throat felt dry. I stood up and raised my flashlight, checking every corner. The chamber was about 15 feet by 15 feet, with stone walls and no windows. I didn't see any other exit. There was no place for someone to hide except behind the racks, but they were against the walls. I backed away, keeping my eyes on that sleeping area. My thoughts bounced around in my head. If the blanket was still warm, the person who used it might be nearby. I might have scared them off. Or maybe they were still somewhere in the manor. I moved back toward the stairs, shining the flashlight around one more time. I didn't see anyone, but the tension in my stomach got worse. The quiet felt heavier. I climbed the steps, my legs feeling unsteady. When I reached the top, I carefully closed the cellar door. I didn't lock it because I didn't have a key, but I wanted to put a barrier between me and that dark space. I stood in the large storage room again and took a few deep breaths. I checked my watch. It was getting late in the afternoon, and the light in the windows had shifted. I decided I had enough footage for the documentary. I also had evidence that someone was living there in secret. I planned to talk to the local historian later and figure out what to do. I didn't want to confront anyone directly. I just wanted to leave without causing trouble. But part of me still wanted to see if I could spot this person, at least from a distance. I packed up my camera gear and slung my bag over my shoulder. I headed back toward the front entrance. The door was still ajar, exactly how I'd left it. As I stepped into the foyer, I heard a scuffling noise upstairs, like shoes on wood. My heartbeat kicked up again. I glanced up the staircase. The second-floor corridor was dim. I couldn't see anyone, but the noise stopped. I stood still, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. I debated whether to call out or ignore it. I decided to keep moving. My nerves were shot, and I didn't want a confrontation. I walked outside and closed the front door behind me. The cool air felt good on my skin. The sun was lower in the sky, and my van looked comforting in the otherwise empty driveway. I quickly walked to it, loaded my equipment, and sat in the driver's seat. I locked the doors out of habit, then started the engine. I gave the manor one last look. The broken windows, the peeling paint, the silent walls, they all seemed to hide a story that someone living there didn't want to share. I drove away, my mind replaying what I'd seen. The attic with fresh wrappers, the cellar with a warm blanket, and the footprints in the dust. I wondered if the person living there felt afraid of me. Maybe they heard me coming and hid. Maybe they'd been in the house for a while, just trying to survive. I felt uneasy, but also curious. I'm used to discovering local histories and filming old sites, but finding someone secretly living in an abandoned manor was new territory for me. When I got back to my place, I offloaded the footage. I watched some of it on my computer to confirm I hadn't imagined the details. Sure enough, there were the plastic bags, the wrappers, the jacket, and the footprints. I could see the outlines of the modern packaging. I could see my own flashlight beam shaking slightly, a sign of how tense I was. In the cellar footage, the blankets and snack packages were clearly visible. I paused the video and stared at the screen, remembering how my stomach knotted at that moment. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that someone was watching me the entire time. I didn't go back to the manor right away. I called the historian and told him what I found. He sounded surprised, but not entirely shocked. He said the place had been left to rot for decades, and that he'd heard rumors of squatters over the years. We decided to keep it quiet for the moment. I still plan to use some footage in my documentary, but I'll edit out the evidence of the person's presence. I don't want the local authorities swarming in and forcing them out. I don't know their situation, but I doubt they mean any harm. Whenever I think of that attic, I remember the soft crinkle of plastic bags and the faint rustling behind me. It makes my pulse pound, even now. I don't have an explanation for every noise I heard that day, but I know I wasn't alone in that house. That's enough to remind me that some abandoned places aren't as empty as they look. And sometimes the secrets they hide aren't about ghosts or legends. They're about real people, living quiet lives in the dark corners we rarely explore. I parked my truck by the curb in front of the old brick building. The windows were boarded up and a few sections of the front wall had chunks missing. I walked up to the entrance with a flashlight in my hand and a clipboard under my arm. My job was to figure out how much debris was inside and how big of a crew I would need to clear it. I'd done this routine in many places before, but this place felt different. The air around the door smelled stale, and I noticed a broken chain on the ground near the entrance. Someone must have cut it to get in at some point. I reached for the steel door. It was slightly ajar, and I pulled it open. It scraped against the floor, making a rough sound that echoed. My flashlight beam showed a dusty hallway leading to the main area on the ground floor. The space was littered with shattered tiles, busted drywall, and pieces of wood. There were some metal frames, maybe from furniture or old equipment. Water stains ran along the walls, and a few exposed wires stuck out near the ceiling. I stepped in and felt the crunch of debris under my boots. I tried not to trip over the pieces of concrete or random junk. The air was thick with dust, and I coughed a few times. I clicked my flashlight to a brighter setting, scanning the corners. I had a sense that someone else might be in the building, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Still, I felt uneasy. My shoulders tensed, and I kept glancing around. I walked deeper into the main floor. The place looked like it used to be some sort of office or maybe a reception area. There was a big desk on its side near one wall, and I spotted a few dark stains on the floor. I didn't want to step on them, so I walked around. I heard my own footsteps echo, and every time I stopped, the building felt too quiet. Only drips of water from somewhere above broke the silence. I made notes on my clipboard about the volume of debris. There were broken ceiling tiles scattered all over. Broken glass from windows lay in piles near the walls. I thought I saw an old elevator shaft on the other side of the room, but I didn't feel like investigating it yet. My plan was to do a quick sweep of the ground floor, then check the upper floors if the stairs looked stable. I moved a piece of drywall aside with my foot. The flashlight beam caught a large hole in the wall. It looked like someone had torn out parts of the wall to get to the wiring. I took a few more steps, listening to the crunch of debris. Then I heard a sudden thump that came from somewhere behind me. I spun around and aimed my flashlight, but I only saw dust in the beam's path. I tried to slow my breathing. My pulse was a little faster than usual. I told myself that old buildings make noises. There could be rats, stray cats, or even a homeless person. I decided to call out, "Hello, anyone here?" My voice echoed. No one answered. The hair on my arm stood up, and I couldn't explain why. I took a few slow breaths and continued toward a door that looked like it might lead to a side room. The doorknob was missing, so I pushed it open with my foot. The hinges squeaked. The small room was filled with more rubble. Pieces of tile were stacked in one corner. There was a strong smell of mold. A broken shelf leaned against the far wall. I shone the flashlight along the shelf. Nothing interesting, just old boxes and some trash. I heard another drip of water. I located the source, a damaged pipe overhead. Water droplets slid down a bent piece of metal and fell into a small puddle on the floor. I stepped back to avoid getting dripped on. My flashlight flickered for a second and I gave it a shake. I stood there, trying to decide if this room was worth examining in more detail. Then I felt a sudden pressure on my arm. It was firm, like a hand grabbing me. The grip felt real and it sent a jolt of shock through my body. My eyes widened and my stomach lurched. I snapped my head to the side, aiming the flashlight toward where I felt the grip. But there was nothing. My heart thumped so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I yanked my arm away by reflex. The pressure vanished, like it had never been there. I couldn't speak. I held my flashlight with a shaking hand. I turned in a full circle, checking every corner, but I didn't see a single person. My throat was dry. My arm tingled where I had felt that grip. It felt like fingerprints pressed into my skin. I took a step back, stumbling a bit on a chunk of concrete. My knee bumped against a bent piece of rebar. I realized I was panting. I could hear my breath echo in my ears. My mind raced. Maybe I had brushed against something sharp, but my sleeve was rolled up to my elbow. I should have felt a scrape, not a grip, and I didn't see anything that could have latched onto my arm that hard. I spun around again, shining the beam in short bursts, checking behind the broken shelf. Nothing moved, not even a rat or spider. I swallowed hard. My instincts told me to get out of there. I rushed out of the small room, heading back to the hallway. My boots kicked up dust and I coughed again. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. Nothing was there, just the flickering shadows. My mouth felt sour. I needed fresh air, so I jogged toward the entrance, stepping over debris without caring about the noise. Every little sound, the crunch under my feet, the drip of water, the creak of the old ceiling, made me more anxious. I just wanted to leave. When I reached the door, I shoved it open harder than I intended. It made a loud scrape, but I didn't care. I stepped outside into the daylight. The relief was immediate. The air smelled fresher and the sunlight felt warmer than before. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a long breath. My skin felt clammy and my shirt stuck to my back. I was covered in a layer of dust and sweat. I looked down at my forearm. There were red marks, shaped almost like fingers. They weren't cuts. They looked more like bruises or welts. I placed my own hand next to them to compare. The spacing was different. It didn't match my own hand. My stomach turned as I realized it really looked like someone else had grabbed me. I rubbed the spot. It felt tender. My head pounded with questions. Did someone sneak up on me? Was there some trick of the debris that pinched my arm? But I knew what I felt. It was firm, like a human hand. I couldn't deny it, and the proof was right there on my arm. I kept trying to calm myself, pacing a little near the curb. I glanced at my truck, then back at the building. Part of me wanted to get back in there and search the place again, just to prove I wasn't losing it. But another part of me wanted to leave and never come back. I decided to at least gather my thoughts. I leaned against the side of my truck and sipped some water from a bottle I had in the cab. The water tasted flat, but it helped. I wiped the sweat from my face with my sleeve, leaving a streak of dust on the cloth. My arm still throbbed where the marks were. I kept staring at them. They looked so distinct, like someone had grabbed me with force. I shook my head and tried to reason through it. The building was old. Maybe the atmosphere was playing tricks on me. Maybe I bumped into something that had an odd shape, but the shape on my arm looked too much like fingers. I couldn't ignore it. My shoulders felt tight and I realized I was clenching my jaw. I tried to loosen up, rolling my neck side to side. I walked around to the back of my truck and looked at the equipment I'd brought. I had some gloves, a hard hat, a pry bar, and a flashlight charger. I considered going back inside with more protective gear. Then I remembered the feeling of that grip, how sudden it was. My chest tightened at the thought of stepping inside again. I decided to do a quick walk around the outside of the building. I wanted to see if there were any open windows or side doors. I walked along the cracked sidewalk, passing boarded windows and piles of trash. Weeds poked through the concrete. I saw some graffiti on the side walls. It was nothing special, just random tags. There was a rusted dumpster around the back, overflowing with bags of who knows what. Flies buzzed around it. The stench of rot filled my nose, and I backed away. I found a side entrance, also boarded up, with a broken lock on a chain. It looked old. I tugged on the board. It didn't budge. The wood was splintered in places. I peered through a gap, but it was too dark to see much. I heard a faint rustle, but it could have been wind or an animal. I stepped away and walked to the rear of the building. The old loading dock was piled with broken pallets. The big metal garage-style door was partially open, but it was dark inside. I aimed my flashlight in there from the outside. I saw more debris and broken furniture. The place felt abandoned and wrong. I couldn't shake that tension in my stomach. I circled back to the front and stopped to catch my breath. My boots were coated in dust and my arms felt shaky. The marks on my arm were still there, just as red. I looked at them again. They felt warmer than the rest of my skin. It freaked me out. I clenched my fists and closed my eyes, trying to decide what to do next. I thought about my job. My boss wanted a quick assessment. Normally, I'd go floor by floor, take photos, and figure out the disposal plan. But that grip felt too real, and I wasn't sure I could walk through that place alone. My chest felt tight with dread. I checked my watch. I realized I'd only been in the building for maybe 20 minutes. It felt longer. I decided I needed backup. I pulled out my phone and tried to call a coworker. The signal was weak, and the call didn't go through. I walked closer to the street until I got a signal. I called a buddy from work and told him I needed help with a site. I didn't mention the weird stuff. I just said I wasn't comfortable going in there alone, and that the structure might be unsafe. He said he could come by in an hour or so. I sat in my truck with the engine running, letting the air conditioner blow away some of the dust. My heart was still racing, and I kept checking my arm, half expecting those marks to fade away. They didn't. They stayed, red and shaped like fingers. I flexed my arm, and it stung a bit. I drank more water and waited, tapping the steering wheel. I watched the building's entrance like I expected someone to walk out. No one did. When my coworker arrived, I got out of the truck and showed him the marks on my arm. He gave me a confused look. I explained that something weird happened inside. I told him I felt a hand on me. He glanced at the building and then back at me. He said maybe I was just jumpy from the environment. I shrugged, but I knew what I felt. Still, I let him think what he wanted. We decided to go in together. We each had a flashlight and gloves. I also carried a small crowbar. We walked through the door. The air felt thick again. Dust motes floated in the flashlight beams. We checked the big room and the side room where I'd felt that grip. Nothing looked out of place, except for the debris. No footprints, no signs of anyone hiding. He joked that the place was creepy, but he didn't seem nervous. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my pulse was still high. After a quick sweep, he said he didn't see anything worth worrying about. The structure seemed stable enough for our usual crew. I nodded, but I stayed close to him. I felt safer with a second person there. He didn't mention feeling anything on his arm. I didn't either, and I certainly didn't want to linger. We left after making some notes about the needed equipment. Outside, I caught another glimpse of those red marks on my arm. They weren't as bright, but they were still there. My coworker looked at them again. He suggested maybe it was an allergic reaction to something in the debris, I didn't bother arguing. I told him it felt like a person's grip. He just shrugged. We packed up and left the property. I felt a wave of relief once we were a few blocks away. I didn't look back. Later that night, I checked my arm at home. The marks had turned into faint bruises. I pressed on them, and they hurt a bit. I kept replaying the moment in my head. The sensation of fingers pressing into my skin wouldn't leave my thoughts. I knew I hadn't imagined it, and the prints proved something touched me. I didn't have an explanation, and I wasn't going to invent one. All I knew was that, in that dark, dusty room, something grabbed me and I couldn't see it. I went to bed feeling uneasy, my thoughts racing. The building was just supposed to be another rundown place in a long list of jobs. I never expected to walk away with those marks on my arm. I never expected to run out of there like some frightened rookie. But I did, and those red marks stayed with me for days. I still don't have a solid explanation. I haven't gone back there alone, and I don't plan to. I've done plenty of tough cleanouts, but something in that place was different. Maybe it was just the stale air in my imagination. Maybe it was something that had no business grabbing my arm. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. All I know is that I felt a grip on my arm and I ran out of there faster than I'd ever run from any job. When I look at my forearm, I still picture those red, finger-like marks. They remind me that sometimes you can't see what's right next to you, and sometimes you just have to get the hell out. I drove about 40 minutes from my place that morning. The roads were mostly empty. I left home before sunrise because I wanted to check out a section of forest I had never explored. It wasn't on any official trekking map, but I enjoy finding quiet spots where I can walk without running into crowds. I felt awake and excited. My back seat had my hiking pack, a water bottle, a small first aid kit, and a few snacks. I parked near a gravel shoulder by a cluster of tall pine trees. The air smelled damp and fresh. I locked my car and started walking. I stepped onto a narrow dirt path that seemed half made by some animal traffic, or maybe old logging routes. There wasn't a marked trailhead, but I guessed it went roughly northwest, deeper into the woods. The sun rose behind me, lighting the tops of the trees. I heard the buzz of insects. The forest floor was covered in moist leaves, branches, and moss. With every step, the ground gave a slight squish or crack. I felt small sticks snap under my boots. My phone had 1 or 2 bars of reception, but it was spotty. I decided I would rely on my sense of direction and some offline maps if needed. I kept moving for about half an hour. The terrain stayed mostly flat, but I noticed more rocks and fallen logs than usual. I had to duck under low-hanging branches. At one point, I paused to drink some water. The forest was quiet, except for my breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. I could feel the air growing thicker as I went deeper. The temperature felt a bit cooler under the shade, but the humidity clung to my skin. My shirt stuck to my back. I wiped some sweat from my forehead and kept going. After another 10 minutes, I spotted something odd. At first, I thought it was a random pile of leaves. Then I realized it was fabric. I walked closer and saw a small clearing with 3 tents. They were camouflaged, sort of dull green, blending with the surrounding brush. I saw them at an angle through the trees, so they didn't jump out right away. My heart rate picked up. I thought maybe some hunters or other hikers had set up camp, but the entire place felt strange. It wasn't an official campsite, and I didn't see any sign of a fire ring or typical camping arrangements. I stepped carefully, trying not to make too much noise. I wasn't sure if anyone was inside those tents. My gut told me something was off. As I got closer, I saw a few items scattered around. A pair of boots, some plastic bags, and a couple of empty water bottles. It looked like people had been there recently. There were pans near a makeshift cooking area. They had dried food residue in them, like someone cooked something not too long ago. I saw an improvised torch leaning against a tree trunk. Its tip was blackened, suggesting it had been lit recently. The smell of stale smoke lingered in the air. I stood still and listened. The forest around me was quiet, but my ears picked up faint rustling that could have been the wind or an animal. My pulse thumped in my chest. I felt my legs tense up. I had a weird sensation that someone was watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anybody. The tents were zipped up. No movement. It felt too quiet. I couldn't ignore the sensation that I was being observed. I swallowed hard and stepped a bit closer, glancing at the tents from the side. One of them had its flap slightly open at the base, like someone left it unzipped at the bottom. I crouched down and tried to peek inside without actually touching anything. I saw a sleeping bag tossed to one side and a small flashlight on the floor. There was a foldable chair knocked over near the entrance. I didn't hear any breathing or stirring. That made me uneasy. It looked like whoever was there had either left in a hurry or was hiding somewhere. I felt the hair on my arms rise. My stomach knotted up, and I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple. I stood back up and slowly walked around the clearing. My boots brushed against damp leaves, and each step sounded too loud in my ears. I felt exposed. I didn't see footprints that would indicate a large group, but I definitely saw footprints. Some were deeper, probably from boots, and a few looked like they might have been made by lighter shoes. I counted at least 4 different shoe patterns. The overlapping marks were scattered around the tents, heading in various directions. It was hard to tell how old they were, but the ground felt soft. Some impressions were fresh enough that the edges hadn't collapsed. I was tempted to call out, but something in my gut told me to stay quiet. It didn't feel right to announce my presence. I kept my voice inside and scanned the tree line around the clearing. There were tall pines, thick patches of brush, and large boulders. Anyone could be behind one of those trees, watching me. I felt my adrenaline rise. My shoulders stiffened. My breaths grew shorter. I told myself to stay calm, but my instincts were on high alert. I decided I should leave the clearing and see if I could circle back to the main path. Maybe I'd contact the local ranger station or something like that once I had a clear signal. I took one step toward the trees, and I heard a twig snap from somewhere off to my left. It might have been an animal, but it froze me in place. I didn't move for a few seconds. My eyes darted around, but I saw nothing. My heart hammered in my ears. The forest was silent again, but that moment left me feeling vulnerable. I turned slowly and started moving away from the tents, trying to keep as quiet as possible. My boots still crunched leaves, but I tried to place my steps carefully. I kept checking over my shoulder, but all I saw were tall tree trunks and dense undergrowth. I walked back in the direction I had come from, or at least what I believed was the direction. After a few minutes, I realized I might be veering off track. I recognized some landmarks, like a big fallen tree with broken branches, but then the path seemed to curve in a way I didn't remember. My phone's GPS was weak. The offline map was slow to update, so I had to rely on my sense of direction. My tension grew. I didn't want to wander aimlessly while feeling like I was being watched. I paused behind a thick tree trunk and took a few breaths. My palms felt clammy. My throat was dry. I sipped some water from my bottle. I reminded myself that I had decent navigation skills, but the nerves were getting the best of me. I pulled out the offline map app, waited for it to grab my approximate location, and tried to orient myself. I saw that I was slightly east of where I planned to be. I decided to angle northwest and hopefully rejoin the route I used earlier. I stayed alert as I moved. Every sound around me felt magnified. The rustle of leaves in the breeze made me tense up. A distant bird call jolted me for a second. I kept picturing a figure stepping out from behind a tree, but no one appeared. My stomach was in knots. I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep going. Step by step, I made my way through the undergrowth. I tried not to think about how weird that campsite was or why those tents were abandoned. All I knew was that I wanted to get out of there. After about 15 minutes of careful walking, I found a stream. The water was shallow, flowing slowly over rocks and roots. I recognized this stream from an earlier part of my hike. It ran parallel to the rough path I had followed before. That gave me some relief. At least I had a reference point. I decided to follow the water downstream until I reached the spot where I first crossed it. Then I could retrace my steps back to the car. My legs were starting to feel shaky from a mix of anxiety and the uneven ground. My breath felt unsteady, but I kept pushing forward. The light started to shift as the sun moved overhead. The canopy was thick in some areas, so parts of the forest looked dim, even though it was still daytime. My boots occasionally slipped on mossy rocks by the stream, forcing me to step carefully. I kept checking behind me, though I never saw anyone. I did have that persistent feeling of eyes on my back. It made the hairs on my neck prickle. Every time a branch snapped or a bird flew by, I'd jump a little. My mind conjured images of whoever camped there following me quietly. Eventually, I found the spot where the path had crossed the stream. The ground was disturbed there, with some boot prints near the water's edge. I felt a slight rush of relief. I recognized the shape of a large rock near the bank that I'd passed earlier in the morning. I stepped across carefully. The rocks were slick, but I managed not to slip. Then I headed up the slope to what I hoped was the same rough trail I had used before. My phone had a few bars now, so I felt better about at least being able to make a call if something happened. I walked for another 10 minutes, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. I saw only trees and brush. I heard only the natural sounds of the forest. Slowly, my nerves started to settle, though I kept glancing behind me. I had a strong urge to break into a jog, but I controlled it because I didn't want to risk twisting an ankle or losing the path. I told myself that if there were people in those tents, maybe they were harmless or just shy. But the condition of that campsite felt wrong. The leftover pans, the improvised torches, and the silent tension made it seem more suspicious than a casual camp. At last, I spotted the gravel patch where I had left my car. I felt a wave of relief as the roof came into view through the tree line. The morning sun was brighter now, illuminating everything more clearly. I hurried the last stretch, my boots crunching against small stones and twigs. When I reached the vehicle, I unlocked it right away, threw my pack inside, and closed the door behind me. I let out a long breath and just sat in the driver's seat, my heart still thudding. I took a moment to gather myself. My hands were shaky on the steering wheel. I debated whether I should call someone about those tents. I thought about the local park rangers or the county sheriff's department. I wasn't sure if I had stumbled onto some kind of private hunting setup or something more sinister. My gut still told me it was off. I decided to drive a bit closer to town before making any calls. The cell coverage would be better, and I could think more clearly once I was away from that place. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road. My tires kicked up a little dust. I checked my rearview mirror a few times, half expecting to see a figure step out of the forest. There was nothing but trees and brush. The tension in my shoulders remained as I navigated the winding road back to the main highway. Once I hit the pavement, I felt my body ease up slightly. The hum of other cars in the distance and the occasional farmhouse on the side of the road reassured me that I was back in familiar territory. I drove until I reached a gas station about 15 minutes away. I parked near one of the pumps and turned off the car. My hands were still a bit shaky, and my mouth was dry. I walked inside and bought a cold drink. The fluorescent lights and the hum of the coolers felt oddly comforting. I realized how tense I was out in the woods. After a few sips of water, I stepped aside and pulled out my phone. I dialed the non-emergency line for the local ranger station and tried to explain what I saw. A hidden campsite, seemingly abandoned, but with signs of recent activity. I mentioned that I felt watched, but didn't see anyone. The person on the other end said they'd send someone to check it out. They also asked me for specifics about the location, so I gave the best directions I could. After that, I just sat in my car for a moment, thinking about how the day turned out. I'd started off wanting a peaceful hike, and I ended up feeling like I stumbled onto something I shouldn't have seen. My heart rate was almost back to normal, but my chest still felt tight. No part of me wanted to go back to investigate on my own. I knew I'd stay away from that area for a while. If the rangers found something, they'd handle it. I had a strong urge to drive home, lock my door, and relax on my couch. That's exactly what I did. I left the gas station, got on the highway, and headed back to my place. The entire drive, I kept replaying the scene in my head. The tents, the footprints, The leftover food, the torch, that feeling of being watched. It still made me uneasy. Even though I was safely in my car, I felt like I could sense eyes on me. By the time I got home, I was exhausted from all the tension. I locked my door, double-checked it, and set my pack down. I turned on the TV for background noise because the silence of my apartment reminded me too much of the silence in those woods. That was the day I learned that not every unexplored patch of forest is worth hiking alone. Sometimes you find signs of other people and you can't be sure if they want to be found. I never heard back from the rangers about it, and I decided not to call again. I stayed away from that area and chose more familiar trails after that. When I think of those tents, I still get a chill down my spine. I can almost feel the weight of someone's gaze from behind the trees. I've done plenty of hikes before and since, but I've never forgotten the feeling I had that day. The sense that I was intruding on someone else's territory, and they were just out of sight tracking my every move. I stood in front of that boarded-up nursing home and felt a tight knot in my stomach. I never liked the idea of sneaking into places, but I promised my mother I would do whatever it took to find her old documents. She worked there years ago, back when the lights still worked and the place smelled like antiseptic. The building closed down after financial problems, and it had been locked up ever since. The front doors had thick chains on them, so I walked around to the back. The windows were boarded up except for one near the far corner. The wood had rotted and pulled away from the frame. I noticed a small opening near the top, big enough for me to push through. I tested the window. It creaked, but it moved. The glass was cracked, so I was careful not to cut myself. The last thing I needed was a trip to the hospital. I used both hands to lift myself up, pressed my elbows onto the sill, and wriggled inside. My sneakers scraped against the concrete walls as I slid in. Once I got my legs through, I dropped down onto a dusty tile floor. The dust in the air made my nose itch. I brushed myself off and tried to get my bearings. I switched on the small flashlight I had in my jacket pocket. The beam cut through thick darkness. Inside, the hallway stretched in both directions. The walls had peeling paint, and there was a stale smell that reminded me of damp newspapers. Water dripped from somewhere in the distance, hitting the floor in a slow, steady rhythm. I took a deep breath and walked down the corridor. My footsteps echoed, so I tried to move slowly. I didn't want to startle any security guard or squatters, if there were any. I remembered my mother's description of the place. She said the records room was on the second floor, at the end of the east wing hallway. I had to find a staircase or an elevator shaft, but I wasn't sure where it was anymore. The signs on the walls were faded. I walked with my flashlight angled toward the peeling directories. The letters were hard to read, but I could make out the words kitchen and laundry on a sign pointing to the left. I knew that meant the administrative section was probably the other way. As I moved toward the administrative section, I felt the floor tiles shift under my feet. Some of them were loose, and a couple cracked when I stepped on them. The echo in the hallway got louder with each step. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my heart thumped a bit faster than normal. The darkness felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I focused on my mission. I told myself I would find the documents, get out, and lock the place up behind me. I had no plans to stay longer than necessary. The corridor opened into a larger reception area. I saw an old desk to the right. It had a phone on it, but the cord was yanked out. The seat behind it was covered in a layer of dust. There were papers scattered around, but they looked like old mail and invoices. I rifled through a few of them, holding the flashlight between my chin and chest. Nothing seemed relevant. They were mostly utility bills and outdated schedules. I moved on, stepping behind the desk to search drawers. Everything was either empty or filled with junk, pens with no ink, coffee-stained stationery, and a few office supplies. I sighed and stood up again, feeling the wood creak under my weight. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of a bright flash. It lit up the corridor past the reception area for a brief second. It looked like a beam from a flashlight, but it was gone before I could get a clear idea of where it came from. My first thought was that I might have triggered a motion sensor or something, but that didn't make much sense in a place this neglected. I stood still. I tried to listen for footsteps or any kind of sound that would tell me someone else was there. My mouth went dry and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I gathered my nerve and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice bounced off the walls. I waited but got no response. I thought about the possibility of an actual security guard making rounds, but why would they be so quiet? Why wouldn't they shout back, or at least tell me to leave? I decided to keep moving, but I stayed on high alert. If I really was trespassing on private property, I needed to be ready to explain myself. I found a sign on the wall near a set of stairs that led to the second floor. The arrow next to Records and Administration pointed up. I headed up the stairs, shining my flashlight on each step. They were concrete and bits of paint chips were scattered everywhere. I could smell mildew more strongly the higher I climbed. It was like the second floor had taken more water damage over the years. At the top of the stairs, I turned left because that was where the sign had indicated the records room should be. The hallway had a series of doors on both sides. The old plaques next to each door were tarnished and barely readable. I pointed the flashlight at them as I passed, looking for something that said records or archives. Most of them just had numbers that probably corresponded to offices or small storage closets. Then I found a door that read medical records. The paint was chipped, but I could still make out the words. I reached for the doorknob and tried to turn it. It was stiff. I jiggled it harder and it finally gave. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The smell of damp cardboard and old paper overwhelmed me right away. My nose twitched and I sneezed twice. I recovered and swept the flashlight beam around the room. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls. There were also stacks of boxes on a long wooden table in the center. Some boxes had collapsed under their own weight, spilling folders onto the floor. I closed the door behind me. I didn't want to be surprised by anyone walking in. I hoped the door would stay unlocked from the inside. I noticed a small sliding latch on the door. I quietly slid it shut. Then I started searching for the documents my mom needed. She told me the approximate year and department, but nothing was guaranteed to be in perfect order. The cabinets had old typed labels, but many were faded or torn. I tried to find the ones that might match the time frame she worked there. I opened a few drawers. The metal squeaked and scraped. The folders inside were crammed together. Some had names and dates, others had codes. My mother had been in administrative nursing, so I figured her files would be in a cabinet labeled with something about staff or employee records, but I wasn't sure. I kept looking. My flashlight began to flicker, so I gave it a quick tap against my palm. The light steadied. I knelt beside one drawer that had a series of staff rosters. I saw old timesheets and payroll records. That seemed promising. I flipped through them, squinting at the faded print. I tried to read the employee names. Many were blurred from water damage. Then I noticed a separate folder tucked in the back. It had my mother's name on it in pencil. My heart pounded a bit harder as I reached for it. The folder felt damp, and some of the pages were stuck together. I held the flashlight in my mouth, carefully prying the papers apart. These documents had her staff ID and some old performance reviews. I guessed my mother wanted these for personal reasons, maybe to dispute something from the past or just to have proof of her employment. Either way, I was relieved to find them. I slipped them into a large manila envelope I had brought with me. Then I kept searching to see if there was anything else she might need. After a few minutes, I realized I had probably found everything. I felt a wave of relief. I could leave now. I latched the drawer shut. That was when I heard something outside the door. It sounded like a faint shuffle or a step. I froze, holding my breath. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I listened for another sound, but I didn't hear anything at first. Then I heard a gentle click, like someone tapping the door handle from the other side. I swallowed hard. I reached up slowly and switched off my flashlight. The room went pitch black. I leaned against the cabinet, trying to stay quiet. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was the building settling, or maybe I'd imagined the noise. But then I heard it again. The handle rattled slightly like someone was testing it. I was grateful I'd slid the latch shut. The handle stopped moving. Everything went still. I waited a few seconds, but it felt longer. My palms were sweaty. I wiped them on my jacket and tried not to let my breathing get too loud. Suddenly, I saw a small glow from underneath the door. It looked like someone on the other side was shining a flashlight toward the floor. My body tensed. I pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't hear any voices. I couldn't figure out who it might be or what they wanted. My first impulse was to call out, but that might draw unwanted attention. I decided to stay still and silent. The glow moved away after a few seconds, like whoever was holding the flashlight had stepped back. Then the door handle rattled again, but this time more firmly. It didn't open, though. I kept the latch in place. I realized I needed to get out of there. Hiding in that small room forever wasn't an option. I took a moment to calm myself, then I looked around for another way out. The room had one window high on the wall, but it was boarded over from the outside. I grabbed a metal stool near the table. I set my envelope of documents on top of the filing cabinet for a moment. Then I climbed the stool to check the window. Sure enough, thick boards covered it and I could see no gaps. I was stuck using the door. I climbed back down and picked up my envelope. My hands were shaking and my throat felt tight. I quietly unlatched the door, crouched low, and turned the knob. I eased the door open an inch or two. The hallway lights were off, so I only had the minimal glow of my flashlight, which I still kept off for the moment. I slowly peeked out. The corridor was dark. I couldn't see anyone standing there. I stepped out, trying not to make noise. My sneakers squeaked on the tile, and I winced. I expected someone to jump out, but no one did. I glanced left and right, shining the beam quickly. There was no sign of a person, no sign of a security guard or random intruder. The place was silent except for the distant drip of water. I moved back toward the stairs. I walked quickly but tried to stay alert. My flashlight picked up the dust particles floating around. I swallowed the lump in my throat. When I got to the stairwell door, I eased it open and glanced down the steps. My flashlight showed the path was clear. I started descending, my heart thumping with each step. The air felt thicker, like I was carrying tension in my shoulders. Part of me wanted to dash out of there, but I forced myself to stay calm. Running could cause me to trip or make noise. I reached the bottom of the stairs. I was back near the reception area, where I'd seen the first flash of light. Everything was still dark. I kept my flashlight on a low angle to avoid drawing too much attention. I hurried toward the corridor that led me to the back window. I reached that corridor and found the room with the open window. I'd left the window partially raised, so I moved a box out of the way. Then I hoisted myself up onto the ledge. It took some effort to squeeze through, but I managed to get my torso outside. The fresh air felt cold on my face. I smelled damp earth and old leaves. I pulled my legs out, dropped down onto the ground outside, and took a moment to breathe. I crouched by the building and listened to see if anyone followed me out. No voices, no footsteps, no lights. The place looked just as dark and lifeless from the outside as it did when I arrived. I felt a wave of relief. I tucked the envelope under my arm. My clothes were dirty and my hands were grimy with dust. I got up and walked along the side of the building until I reached the street. The chain-link fence around the property was rusted, but I found a gap and slipped through. I turned back to look at the abandoned structure one last time. The windows were boarded up. The front doors were chained shut. I wondered who or what I had encountered inside. It might have been a guard, but it didn't feel right. I didn't hear any normal commands or warnings, and I never saw a uniform or anything official. It might have been someone else looking for valuables or trying to shelter for the night. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I made my way to my car, which I'd parked a couple of blocks away. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands still felt shaky. I placed the envelope on the passenger seat and stared at it for a second. At least I'd found my mother's documents. I started the engine and pulled away, checking my rearview mirror. Nothing was behind me except empty streets and darkened buildings. I kept my eyes on the road and tried to calm my racing thoughts. By the time I reached my apartment, My nerves had settled a bit. I parked in my usual spot and carried the envelope upstairs. I didn't bother turning on the TV or anything. I just went into my room, dropped the envelope on my desk, and sat on the edge of my bed. My heart rate was slowing down, but my mind kept replaying the flashes of light and the rattling door handle. I didn't have any explanation. All I knew was that I was safe, and I had the records. I decided I'd tell my mother everything in the morning. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but I knew she'd be happy to have what she needed. She might be alarmed about me sneaking in there, but I couldn't see any other way to do it. I didn't plan on returning. There was something unsettling in that building, whether it was just my imagination or something else. I'd done my job. I'd gotten out in one piece. That was enough for me. I took a quick shower to wash off the dust and grime. As I stood there, I felt tension in my neck and shoulders. My muscles ached a little from climbing through windows and ducking around corners. I got out of the shower and toweled off, then went back to my room. I flipped open the envelope just to confirm everything was still there. The papers were slightly damp around the edges, but the text was legible. My mother's name and staff details were clearly visible. I closed the envelope and placed it on my nightstand. I lay down in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. My mind drifted to the moment I saw that bright flash in the corridor. It felt so sudden, like someone intentionally clicked a flashlight on and off. But no one answered when I called out. And then, whoever it was tried the door in the records room. They didn't speak or identify themselves. That stuck with me. It made me wonder if they were just as scared of me as I was of them. Or maybe they had a different motive. Either way, I was out of that place, and I had no reason to go back. I hoped the documents would settle whatever my mother needed. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the memory of that rattling door. My hands were no longer shaking and my breathing was steady. I finally drifted off to sleep, thinking about how strange it was to break into a place my mother once worked. But it was done. I had what I came for, and all I wanted now was some rest. I gripped my flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. The front entrance of the old hospital loomed in front of us, its windows boarded up and its brickwork cracked. I stood there with two classmates, both fellow nursing students, and I could already feel the stale air clinging to my lungs. I didn't want to be the first to step inside, but nobody else moved, so I took that first step across the threshold. My shoes kicked up dust on the worn floor tiles. I shone my flashlight around the lobby. The beam showed rows of dented chairs, an abandoned reception desk, and a few stray papers scattered on the floor. The air smelled like old paper and mildew. Each breath felt thick. The place had closed down due to a lack of funds, and it looked like it had been abandoned in a rush. The overhead lights were broken and cobwebs hung from corners of the ceiling. I saw a small cluster of mold in one corner, and I hoped I wouldn't end up breathing in anything dangerous. But we were there on our own time, not for any official project, so I couldn't exactly complain. We had heard rumors about the basement. People said that was where they kept old patient files, medical records, and large bins of leftover equipment. Some talked about hearing strange sounds down there, like metal scraping against concrete. My friends wanted to see if there was any truth to that. I'm not usually into ghost stories or anything like that, but I wanted a break from textbooks. I also couldn't ignore that nagging curiosity. I'm the kind of guy who likes to see things for myself. We made our way deeper into the hospital. Our flashlights slid over cracked walls and broken exit signs. The hallways felt too quiet. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I kept telling myself it was just an empty building. I glanced at my friends. Gabriel looked uneasy. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead even though it wasn't hot. Jade walked ahead, chewing the inside of her cheek. We didn't talk much. The silence in that place seemed to swallow our voices. Soon we found the stairwell leading down to the basement. The metal door creaked when Gabriel pulled it open. A stale draft rushed up. My nose wrinkled at the smell, like old water and rotten cardboard. The flashlight beams illuminated chipped paint on the stairwell walls. I could see water stains on the ceiling. My steps made hollow echoes on each concrete stair. I tried to focus on my footing, but my mind kept drifting to the rumors. People said they'd heard things moving around down here, like something metallic rolling from one end of the corridor to the other. I kept imagining a wheel or a cart screeching across the floor. Once we reached the bottom, Jade pointed out the sign that read, "Archives" in faded letters. The door had flaking paint, and the handle was covered with dust. She tried it, but it was locked or jammed. She leaned her shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. Gabriel offered to help, but Jade shrugged and said we could look for another entrance or see if there was a disposal area next door. We walked a bit further, stepping over some loose debris, bits of plaster, old papers, and a fallen ceiling tile. Our footsteps echoed in a strange way. Everything sounded sharper down there. Then I heard that metallic noise. It was a rolling or scraping sound, almost like someone pushing a heavy cart with a rusty wheel. It was distant, but it cut through the silence. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Jade turned toward me with wide eyes. Gabriel tilted his head, listening. The noise lasted a few seconds, stopped, then started again. It sounded like it was coming from around the corner, past a row of closed doors. I shone my flashlight that way, trying to see if something was moving. The beam didn't catch any movement, just blank walls and a flicker of dust. We walked down the hall, following the sound. Each time we paused, we'd hear it again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. And then it would stop. The intervals made it creepier, like someone was deliberately pushing, pausing, and pushing again. My stomach tightened and my mouth felt dry. I swallowed hard. A small part of me wanted to turn around and get out. But I told myself we were just dealing with leftover hospital junk. Maybe a cart that had been left leaning against something. Sometimes old buildings settle, or there could be a draft moving items around. I kept going, though my knees felt shaky. Around the corner we found another corridor. The overhead lighting fixtures dangled, and every few steps I'd hear a soft clink from the metal swaying. The floors were littered with old boxes. Some were ripped open, and I saw stacks of brittle folders inside. The air smelled of cardboard and damp concrete. My flashlight beam landed on a door labeled "Disposal." The paint was nearly scraped off. I noticed old medical waste bins lined up along the wall next to it, each with peeling biohazard labels. Some looked empty. Others had their lids sealed shut. It gave me a weird feeling, but I tried to keep calm. We heard the metallic noise again. This time it was much louder. It sounded like it was right in front of us, coming from the disposal room. My heart hammered against my ribs. Gabriel glanced at me. His breathing was fast, and he looked like he was getting second thoughts. Jade whispered that we should take a quick look, just to see if there was something rolling around in there. We agreed. It felt like we couldn't leave without checking. I reached for the door handle. It felt cold and gritty. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the cramped space. My flashlight showed rows of large metal containers, all marked for different kinds of waste. Sharps, paper records, general trash. A strong chemical odor hit me, making my eyes water slightly. The floor was dotted with stains. Some bins were tipped over, and I saw a few scattered gloves and broken glass on the ground. We moved in a few steps. The place felt cramped, with so many metal bins close together. It was hard to walk around without bumping into something. I tried to control my breathing. The tension in my chest grew with each squeak of my shoes. I wanted to find the source of that noise, but I also wanted to get out of there. I waved my flashlight around, scanning the corners for movement. Suddenly, there was a clang. It came from behind a row of stacked containers. I flinched and nearly dropped my flashlight. Jade let out a stifled yelp. Gabriel stepped back, nearly bumping into me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I steadied myself and raised my flashlight higher. That's when I saw a large steel cart with a wobbly wheel. It was resting at a slight angle, as if it had been propped up and then pushed. The wheel was still spinning, making a faint rattling noise, but there was no one there. We walked closer, our flashlights aimed at the cart. I felt a cold sweat on my neck. I checked around the containers. Behind them, underneath them, nothing. No footsteps, no signs of anyone else in the room. Yet the cart had clearly moved. The wheel was still spinning down to a stop. I exhaled, feeling my breath shake. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was impossible not to feel spooked. Jade looked over her shoulder at the open door behind us, probably considering if we should leave. Gabriel mumbled that we should check the rest of the basement. Maybe there was a draft or a slope in the floor. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. I nodded and led the way back into the corridor. When we stepped out, everything was silent again. No scraping, no rolling, just the faint echo of our own footsteps. The tension in my shoulders made me stiff, and I tried to stretch my neck to release some of it. We decided to search a bit more. There was a small office across the hall with a shattered window in the door. I peered through the broken glass. Inside, I saw old desks and chairs. The door was unlocked, so we went in. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled like damp furniture. I went over to a file cabinet that was half open. It looked like someone had rummaged through it. The drawers were empty except for a few random documents. I thumbed through them. They seemed like inventory lists, dates, item names, and signatures. Nothing out of the ordinary. Jade glanced over my shoulder, then started looking through another cabinet. Gabriel stood by the door, keeping watch. I think he was still on edge about the cart. I was too. After a few minutes, we heard the metallic rolling again. It sounded farther away this time, like it had moved down the hallway. That scrape, scrape, scrape noise made my heart skip a beat. Jade put the papers down and exchanged a worried glance with me. Gabriel clenched his flashlight, his jaw tight. None of us spoke. We just knew we had to see where it was coming from. Or maybe we felt like we had to confirm we weren't imagining it. We stepped back into the corridor. The hallway stretched ahead with flickering shapes from our flashlights dancing on the walls. We followed the noise. It would start, then stop, start, then stop. Each time it felt like it was leading us somewhere. My stomach churned with anxiety. I kept telling myself not to panic, but I could feel my nerves on edge. My breathing grew shallow, and I noticed my hands shaking. I gripped the flashlight tighter to steady them. The corridor ended at a heavy double door that had a sign above it, storage. It looked like it once had a security lock system, but the panel was dark. It didn't look like it had power. We tried the doors and they opened with a bit of force. A musty odor came out and I coughed into my shoulder. We stepped inside and found ourselves in a large storage room. Metal shelves lined the walls, most empty, but a few still held cardboard boxes and metal trays. My flashlight beam caught a few blankets folded in a corner, medical supplies sealed in plastic, and some random junk like broken chairs. In the center of the room, I spotted a large rolling container, something like a hospital bed frame without the mattress. One of its wheels was missing a chunk of rubber, and as soon as I saw it, I recognized the possible source of that scraping noise. But it was still. There was no movement. The air felt dense. I walked around it, checking the floor, seeing if there were tracks in the dust. The floor was scuffed, but not enough to clearly show us if it had been moved recently. Jade came up behind me, standing close. I could hear her breathing. Gabriel stayed near the door, shining his flashlight at the shelves. He asked if anyone else noticed the temperature dropping. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I couldn't tell if it was the actual temperature or just pure tension. Then we heard the sound again, right outside the storage room, as if something heavy was rolling in the hallway. It made my scalp tingle. My entire body felt rigid. I looked at Jade and Gabriel, and I could see in their faces that they had the same reaction. That was enough for me. I felt a sense of urgency to leave. I didn't care to solve any more mysteries. The repeated noise, the moving cart, the isolation of that basement, it was all pushing me past my comfort zone. I could sense that we were not going to find a neat explanation, and I wasn't eager to encounter someone lurking down there. We gathered ourselves and stepped back into the corridor. The air was still. The flashlight beams cut through the dust in the air. My palms were sweaty and my breath felt shallow. We stood there for a moment, listening. No noise. Nothing. It felt like we were alone again, but I didn't want to linger. I told Gabriel and Jade that we should head back before we got stuck or lost in that maze of hallways. They agreed without hesitation. Jade glanced around one last time, then nodded. We retraced our steps, our footfalls echoing off the walls. My heart wouldn't calm down. Every now and then I would spin around, aiming the flashlight behind us, half expecting to see something moving. But it was just the corridor, silent and empty. We passed by the disposal room, and I noticed that steel cart in the same position, which at least confirmed it hadn't moved again. That offered me a tiny bit of relief, but I was still on edge. When we finally reached the stairwell, I breathed a sigh of relief. I think we all did. We climbed the steps more quickly than before. My legs felt heavy, like I'd been carrying tension in them the whole time. At the top, we pushed open the door to the first floor. The air felt slightly fresher. We walked through the hospital halls until we got back to the main entrance. Stepping outside felt like breaking the surface of deep water. I took a long breath of the cold evening air. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. We didn't bother hanging around the building. We just walked away from that front entrance and headed to our cars. Nobody said much, but I could see the relief on their faces. My heart rate started to slow, and I wiped the sweat off my forehead with my sleeve. I looked back at the hospital one last time. The broken windows and dark corridors seemed to watch us leave. I felt uneasy, but also strangely satisfied we made it out without stumbling into anything worse. I still don't know how to explain the moving cart and the sounds. Part of me wants to believe it was a draft or a tilted floor, but there was something about those pauses between the scraping noises that felt intentional, like someone or something was doing it on purpose. I didn't lose any sleep that night, but I caught myself jumping at small sounds in my apartment. It made me realize that some things are better left alone. I'm not eager to go back. I don't think Gabriel or Jade will suggest it either. In class the next day, we all avoided talking about it in front of other classmates. It just felt too strange to sum up in a casual conversation. Sometimes I still wonder what caused that metal scraping. Maybe the old hospital has secrets that nobody ever figured out. But I'm fine not knowing the details. We went, we heard enough, and we got out. That's good enough for me. I stepped onto the cracked driveway around noon. I'd been reading about that old psychiatric facility for months, and I finally worked up the nerve to see it in person. The front gates were rusted and bent outward, and someone had spray-painted a warning on the brick wall near the entrance. It felt like nobody had touched this place in years. I walked around the perimeter, looking for any easy way in, and I found a collapsed section of the building where the kitchen used to be. The roof above the kitchen had caved in, leaving a gap wide enough to climb through. I checked my backpack for a flashlight and extra batteries, then pulled myself up over the debris. I'm a 35-year-old guy who's always been interested in psychiatric history. I've read about old treatments, outdated wards, and the ways these places fell out of use. Still, I wasn't prepared for how deserted that kitchen would feel. The tiles on the walls were coated in grime and mold. Pieces of the ceiling clung to broken light fixtures. I saw a massive metal stove in the corner, twisted and rusted. I stepped on shattered glass and felt the crunch under my boots. There was a damp chill that cut through my coat. I could see my breath in front of my face, a white puff drifting in the stale air. The smell was like rotten wood and old grease. I moved carefully to avoid slicing my hands on any exposed metal. The sink area was a mess of twisted pipes. A few old pots and pans were strewn around, spotted with corrosion. I tried not to dwell on how many meals might have been prepared there for patients who never left. I wanted to find the main corridors, so I followed a hallway sign that was barely clinging to the wall. It pointed toward the cafeteria and the staff dining room. Large patches of paint had fallen off, exposing the concrete underneath. My footsteps echoed in the silence, creating a steady rhythm that made me feel uneasy. I found a side door that led into a corridor. The double doors had glass panels, but the glass was spiderwebbed with cracks. I pushed them open and they made a loud screech as the metal hinges resisted. My flashlight beam wobbled on the dirty floor. The corridor had old bulletin boards with scraps of paper. I paused to scan them. Most were announcements, staff schedules, weekly menu plans, and outdated holiday notice. Nothing stood out. No clues about how this place shut down or what it looked like when it was active. It was just ordinary debris from another era. I kept walking. The air was still cold, and I felt a draft coming from somewhere deeper in the building. I passed rooms with chipped paint and broken windows. Some furniture was scattered, old chairs with missing legs, desks with their drawers pulled out. Everything looked ransacked. My shoulders tensed, and I felt my heart pound every time I heard a small sound. Little drops of water trickled from unseen leaks in the ceiling. Every time I heard a drip, I'd stop, hold my breath, and listen to make sure it wasn't someone else's footsteps. I followed a wide staircase up to the second floor. The metal railing felt icy when I gripped it. The steps were caked with dust, and my boots left prints that trailed behind me. I flipped my flashlight around the landing. Old posters about mental health treatments clung to the walls. They were faded and torn, the words mostly unreadable. A few doors were shut tight, and I didn't try them yet. I wanted to get a feel for the place before opening random rooms. The hall on the second floor smelled mustier than the first. The air was stale, with a hint of mildew, like wet newspapers left out for weeks. I noticed a few doors had heavy locks, probably isolation rooms. I moved on, not ready to linger. The corridor led me to another set of stairs. This was a narrower flight, more like an emergency stairwell. It had a metal door at each level. The sign beside it was dirty and illegible, but I guessed it went up to staff offices or patient wings. The second floor hallway was just as cold as the first. My fingers were stiff and my breath felt sharp in my lungs. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead and climbed toward the third floor. About halfway up, I noticed something strange. The air grew warmer. At first, I thought maybe I was just heating up from walking, but I stopped for a moment and felt the temperature. It was definitely warmer. My forehead felt the heat, and my cheeks didn't sting from the cold anymore. I kept climbing. By the time I reached the top of the stairwell, I was sure the temperature was significantly higher. My flashlight illuminated the metal door. It had scratches near the handle like someone had used a tool to pry it open. I turned the knob. The door swung in easily. The hallway ahead was lit by a faint glow from some overhead fixture down the corridor. That was impossible, as I didn't see any generator or working power lines outside. I stepped forward, my flashlight scanning the area. The walls here looked less damaged, as if someone had done repairs. There were fewer cracks, and the dust layer seemed thinner. I walked slowly, aiming the beam along the baseboards. The warmth increased with every step. I wiped sweat off my forehead. My pulse was pounding in my temples. It felt like walking into a heated building in winter, but that made no sense. The facility had been abandoned for decades. There was no sign of a caretaker. I reached a T-junction in the hall and looked both ways. To the left was darkness. To the right, I saw a faint flicker of light. I turned right. I crept along, one foot in front of the other, trying not to make noise. My flashlight caught glimpses of peeling wallpaper and old signage. Then I heard a mechanical hum. It sounded like a radiator or some kind of heating unit. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the noise was real. A consistent whirring followed by an occasional clank, like pipes expanding. I followed the sound to a door on my left. The door was partially open, and a yellowish light leaked into the hallway. My heart raced as I approached. I pushed the door gently and stepped inside. The room was some kind of small common area, with a few wooden chairs shoved against the walls. In the far corner, I saw a large radiator. It looked ancient, the kind with vertical metal fins. It shook a bit, rattling against the floor. Next to it, there was a strange setup of wires connected to its main pipes. The wires were snaking across the floor, taped together in places. They vanished into the ceiling panel, where somebody had removed a tile. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, glowing weakly and flickering every few seconds. That explained the light in the hallway. but there was no reason for it to be powered. I tried to follow the wires with my eyes, but they disappeared into the darkness above. I moved closer to the radiator. The heat radiating off it was intense. My face felt flush and I could smell hot dust. I reached out and touched it carefully. It was scalding. I jerked my hand back. I stared at the improvised setup. The wiring looked handmade, like someone had rigged an extension cord or a series of cords to power this one radiator. But what was the source? There was no generator noise, no visible circuit breakers, just a messy tangle of cables going into the ceiling. I shined my flashlight upward. The ceiling was too high for me to see much. My stomach twisted with anxiety. Who set this up? Why? Was someone living here? I stepped away and scanned the floor for any footprints. I saw some marks in the dust, but I couldn't tell how fresh they were. My mind started to race with possibilities. Maybe a squatter. Maybe an urban explorer who set something up. But this seemed too elaborate for a casual visit. The radiator was definitely drawing power from somewhere. I swung my flashlight around, looking for a door or another exit. The walls were bare except for chipped paint. The chairs in the corners were stacked in a haphazard way. I noticed a small pile of food wrappers under one of the chairs. They looked modern, like something you'd buy from a gas station. That meant someone had been here not too long ago. My breathing became shallow. I felt the hair on my arms stand up, not from cold, but from tension. I looked at the door, wondering if I should leave. My curiosity kept me rooted. I wanted to know how the power was running. I decided to follow the wires if I could find a way into the ceiling or the floor above. I stepped out of the room and back into the hallway. The mechanical hum faded behind me, but the warmth still lingered in the corridor. I took a right, following where I guessed the wires might run. I passed a few closed doors. Each had a small frosted window. I shone the flashlight through them. One looked like a storage closet, another like a small office. The third was locked. I rattled the handle a bit, but it wouldn't budge. The corridor took a sharp turn to the left. Ahead, I saw a hatch in the ceiling. It looked like a maintenance access. Maybe that was where the wires were going. The hatch was slightly ajar. I walked up to it, reached up, and tried to push it open. It didn't move. I tried again, putting more force into it. A faint squeak came from above as it scraped against something. Then the hatch lifted an inch. Dust cascaded down on my shoulders. I coughed and stepped back. I set my flashlight on the floor, shining up at the hatch. I reached both arms overhead, pushed, and felt the hatch swing open. A stale gust of warm air hit my face. I grabbed my flashlight and angled it inside. I could see a crawl space or a narrow loft area. Wires ran across the beams, taped and spliced in different spots. Whoever did this definitely improvised. I considered climbing up, but I wasn't sure if the beams would support my weight. The wood looked ancient and worm-eaten, but I felt driven to understand what was going on. My gut was clenched, and my thoughts were racing. Was someone up there right now? Could they be watching me? I listened for any movement. It was silent except for the faint hum from the radiator room. I pulled myself up through the hatch, taking it slow. My arms strained to lift my body. Once inside, I rested on my stomach and swept the flashlight beam around. The space was cramped, filled with insulation and dusty boards. The wires led toward the far corner, where I noticed a tangle of power strips and old extension cords. They were plugged into a single large cable that snaked into the building's main wiring. It looked like someone had tapped into a power line that still had some juice, maybe from a municipal grid that was never fully disconnected. That explained the light and the heat on the third floor. I felt relief and panic at the same time. Relief that it wasn't something supernatural, panic at the thought of who did this and why. I inched my way closer, trying not to fall through the ceiling. My flashlight shone on random objects scattered around: a box of tools, plastic water bottles, a few empty cans of food, and a sleeping bag rolled up near the corner. My pulse quickened again. Someone had definitely been spending time here. That meant they could be around. My hands felt clammy and sweat dripped from my temples. I felt like I was intruding in a private space. I glanced back at the hatch to make sure I had an exit. It was still open. The corridor below was dark. I crouched there, scanning the area for any sign of recent activity. The food cans were dusty, but not too dusty. The sleeping bag looked unused for a few days, maybe a week. I didn't see any clothing or personal items, just the bare essentials. It wasn't the setup of someone living in comfort, more like someone who needed a heated hideout. My thoughts tumbled in my head. Was this a former patient who never left? Was it an urban explorer who wanted a private workshop? I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that this wasn't normal. I crawled back to the hatch, lowered myself down to the hallway, and landed softly on my feet. My knees felt shaky. I shined my flashlight around again, thinking I should check a couple more rooms before leaving. I tried to quiet my breathing. The building felt too silent, like I was the only one disturbing it. That radiator room rattled again, followed by a hissing noise from the pipes. The heat in the corridor was thick and my clothes stuck to my skin. I decided to check another door across from the hatch. It was slightly open. I eased it wider with my flashlight hand. The room inside was a small office with a single metal desk. A chair sat behind the desk, tilted to one side. The walls had a few old corkboards, empty except for a couple of push pins. On the desk, I saw a folder covered in dust. I blew on it, wiped it off, and shined the light. It was a collection of old staff records and maintenance logs. I flipped through the first few pages. They were from the 70s, listing repairs for the boiler, requests for new equipment, and notes about wing closures. Nothing about who might be here now. I took a few pictures with my phone to look at later. My hands were trembling, so the shots might be blurry. I looked around the office for anything else. The drawers were empty, except for some pens and paper clips. The smell was a bit better here, less musty and more like old paper. My eyes stung from the dust and I blinked a few times to clear my vision. My mind buzzed with the question of what to do next. I could keep exploring, or I could head back. The third floor felt menacing and I didn't want to push my luck. I decided to make my way back downstairs. Maybe I'd come back another day with someone else. I didn't like being alone in a place where someone had clearly set up a secret space. I walked out of the office and retraced my steps. The warmth followed me to the stairwell, but once I passed through the third floor door and started heading down, the cold returned. My body tensed up against the chill. Each step on the metal staircase echoed, and I kept expecting to hear another set of footsteps behind me. But I never did. I reached the first floor and spotted the corridor that led back to the destroyed kitchen. That was my exit. I crawled through the same hole I'd used to enter. The afternoon light outside felt jarring after all that time in dim hallways. I exhaled in relief, my breath visible in the cooler air outside. I glanced back at the crumbling building. The sight of that broken kitchen entrance gave me chills. I had no real explanation for the improvised setup, except that maybe some unknown person had tapped into a lingering power line. I felt uneasy thinking about whoever had done that, but I was also glad I didn't run into them face to face. I walked off the property with my head spinning. The question stayed with me. Who was keeping that radiator running? Where were they now? What else were they doing in that place? I wasn't sure I wanted to find out without backup. Despite my nerves, I knew I'd probably come back. I needed more time to see if there were other hidden rooms or active electrical lines. I liked solving mysteries, even if it freaked me out. As I climbed into my car, I noticed my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My shirt was damp from sweat, and my heart was still beating fast. I drove away, watching the old sanatorium fade in my rearview mirror. The image of that warm third floor wouldn't leave my mind. The rattling radiator, the snaking wires, the flickering light bulb, they felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I told myself I'd get a friend to come with me next time. Maybe someone with more experience exploring abandoned buildings. I wasn't sure what else we would find, but I didn't want to face it alone again. For now, I just tried to calm down. I rolled down the window to let the cold breeze wash over me. It felt good. It reminded me I was back outside, away from that claustrophobic heat. Yet I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. The thought of that hidden sleeping bag, the food wrappers, and the improvised wiring made my skin crawl. Someone was out there, quietly maintaining a piece of this dead facility. No sign of a generator, no sign of a caretaker, no one in sight. But something was alive in that building's electrical system. I couldn't figure out why. That mystery hung over me like a question with no clear answer. I just knew I wasn't finished with this place. The next time I stepped inside, I'd be ready for whoever else might be calling it home, and I'd bring a better flashlight. I walked into that building with a sense of duty, not curiosity. I had a straightforward job: inspect the structural integrity of a foreclosed office complex that closed down after bankruptcy. I wasn't there to explore or poke around in offices that had been abandoned. My goal was simple: to assess the condition of the walls, floors, and support beams so I could figure out what needed repair or what was salvageable. I entered through a back door that was ajar because it seemed like the most convenient path. It didn't even cross my mind that I might get stuck in there with no quick way out. But after a few minutes inside, I realized I was standing in a dead-end corridor. And when I tried to go back out, the door I'd come through was locked or jammed. It was a moment that rattled me because it felt like something I should have been able to avoid. Then I heard steps. Heavy steps that echoed in the narrow hallway. They were steady and getting louder. I had no clue who or what was coming toward me, and I didn't see any windows to check. My only choice was to force that door until the hinges broke. That's how I got out, but not before my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I started my day early. I arrived at the property around 9 in the morning, hoping to be out by lunchtime. The front entrance was boarded up. Big slabs of plywood covered the main doors, and there were large "no trespassing" signs in faded letters. It's not unusual for closed buildings to be boarded up like that, so I didn't think too much of it. I walked around back to see if there was an alternate entrance. Sure enough, there was a simple metal door that had some rust around the edges. It was slightly open, and I remember thinking it was a bit odd. Usually these places are locked tight, either to keep squatters out or just to keep everything secure. But this door was almost inviting me in. I should have been more cautious, but I figured maybe someone else had been in there recently. Another inspector, a bank rep, or even a security guard. Once inside, the first thing I noticed was the stale air. It smelled like old carpet and damp drywall. The corridor was dim. The overhead lights didn't work, so I relied on the sunlight slipping through cracks and dusty windows at the far end of the building, even though none were in my immediate path. I tried flicking a few light switches out of habit, but nothing happened. The floor was covered in debris, scattered papers, chunks of plaster, pieces of wood. I stepped carefully to avoid twisting my ankle on any broken tiles. I made my way down the hall, checking the walls for cracks and uneven surfaces. The building was quiet, and the emptiness made it feel even larger than it was. Sometimes I saw mold creeping along the baseboards or large stains on the ceiling. In some spots, the smell was intense, like rotted carpet, but there were no major water leaks that I could see. I wrote a few notes on a small pad marking areas of concern. After about 10 minutes, I reached the end of the corridor. That's when I realized there wasn't a door leading to another section. It was just a dead end. I turned around to go back the way I came, but as I retraced my steps, something felt off. The corridor seemed darker, and I thought maybe the clouds outside had moved. I walked up to the back door, the one I'd come through. It was a simple metal door with a push bar on the inside. When I pushed down on the bar, the door didn't budge. I tried again, a bit harder, and heard a dull thud like the door was jammed. I assumed maybe something had fallen against it on the outside or the lock was damaged. I felt a flicker of nervousness, but I've dealt with stuck doors before. My plan was to give it a good shove. I dropped my tool bag on the floor to free my hands. I leaned my shoulder against the door, braced my feet, and pushed. Nothing. I tried again, using a bit more force. Still nothing. I checked the edges for a hinge I could tap loose, but it was the type of door with hidden hinges on the inside. I muttered to myself that maybe the door had some mechanical lock that engaged when I'd closed it behind me without noticing. That was possible. I considered removing the push bar hardware to see if I could manually release the latch, so I reached into my tool bag to grab a screwdriver. I started unscrewing the plate around the bar, but the screws were rusted and didn't budge easily. As I stood there fiddling with the door, I heard something that made my neck tingle. It was a distant thump, like someone's footstep. I lifted my head and listened. Another step, then another. It was methodical and somewhat slow, but it had weight to it. The sound was coming from behind me, back down the corridor, around a bend, or maybe from a staircase I hadn't noticed. I stopped messing with the screws and turned around. The place was too dim to see very far, but I could hear the thumping growing closer, one slow step at a time. My chest tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone else there, and I wasn't sure if it might be a security guard or a homeless person or something else. I had no idea if they were friendly or hostile. I quickly grabbed my tool bag, zipped it up, and swung it over my shoulder. I stepped to the side of the corridor, pressing my back against the wall near the door, trying to stay quiet. My heart pounded. The steps got louder, and I felt a burst of adrenaline. All I could think about was how I had no real weapon and didn't want any confrontation. I just wanted to get out of that building. I listened closely, trying to gauge how close those footsteps were. The place echoed, so it was hard to tell exactly how far away they were or which direction they were going. The corridor remained dark, and I still couldn't see a figure. I might have whispered a few curses under my breath because the tension was driving me crazy. There were no windows in that hallway, no side doors, and no second exit. I felt trapped. I made a decision. I'd try to force the door open. Screwdrivers weren't enough. I had a small crowbar in my bag that I used for prying old boards. I pulled it out. It wasn't big, maybe a foot long, but it had a solid edge that could give me some leverage. I wedged the crowbar between the door and the frame, near the latch, and pushed. I strained my arms and shoulders, trying to pry it open. The metal groaned, but the latch stayed locked. Behind me, the footsteps continued. I imagined someone stepping around debris or maybe dragging a heavy boot. My hands shook from the effort and from my growing panic. My palms were sweaty. The crowbar slipped a bit and I almost lost my grip. The footsteps got louder, so I pushed again, using my whole body weight. The door frame creaked. I could see a slight gap opening near the hinges. It wasn't the latch that was giving way, it was the hinge side. If I kept going, maybe I could break the hinges or the surrounding wood. I shoved harder, feeling a jolt in my elbow. The gap widened. I yanked out the crowbar, repositioned it near the top hinge, and leaned in with everything I had. My mind raced. I was thinking about who was walking my way. I had to assume it was a person, but I didn't know if they were hostile. I also wondered if maybe it was security and I'd get arrested for trespassing, but I figured I'd rather explain myself to the cops outside than be cornered in a dark hallway. I kept pushing the crowbar, and the hinge started to bend. The metal squealed, a sound that echoed in the silent corridor. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder. I still couldn't see anyone, but the steps were definitely closer. There was a rhythm to them. It wasn't random. It sounded like someone large, moving deliberately. I could almost feel the vibration with each step. My breathing was fast and my heart hammered against my chest. I remember telling myself, keep going. Don't freeze. Just get the door open. I braced my foot against the wall for leverage and gave one more hard push. The hinge snapped with a sharp pop, and the top of the door jutted outward. I pried the crowbar down toward the lower hinge. The door was angled, so I had a bit more room now. I used the same technique. Push, reposition, push again. The metal frame around the lower hinge started to tear. It made a scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. The footsteps were so close now that I expected someone to come around the corner at any second. My entire body shook with adrenaline. I pressed one last time, and the door tore away from the frame. It didn't fall off completely, but it was loose enough for me to shove it open from the bottom. I squeezed my body through the gap, my shoulder scraping against rough metal. It scratched me, but I barely felt it in that moment. Once I was outside, I stumbled and nearly fell on some loose gravel. There was a jolt of bright light, the midday sun hitting my eyes after the dim interior. I squinted, took a breath of fresh air, and felt relief flood my system. But I didn't linger. I shoved the door from the outside. It hung crooked, no longer able to close properly. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but that might have been because my ears were ringing from the tension. I turned around and jogged away, passing a few dumpsters and then circling around to the front parking lot. I paused by my truck, trying to steady my breathing. My chest burned. I felt sweat on my forehead and under my arms. My heart was still pounding. I looked back at the building. From this angle, it was just a block of concrete and windows. It didn't look threatening, but I knew something strange was inside. Maybe it was just a guard checking the premises. Or maybe it was someone else who'd found a way in. I didn't see any obvious signs of life. The place looked dead from the outside. I opened my truck door and tossed my bag onto the passenger seat. My crowbar was still in my hand, and I realized I was gripping it so tight my knuckles were white. I set it down and took a few deep breaths. My heart rate was still high and my muscles felt tight. I glanced at the building one more time. I wondered if I should call someone to report that the back door was damaged and that there might be someone inside. But then I considered that I'd forced it open myself. I also had no solid evidence of wrongdoing besides hearing footsteps. There was no sign of a break-in, at least not that I'd noticed before. The building was already foreclosed and boarded up. I decided to leave. My plan was to tell my boss about what happened. Maybe we'd arrange a proper inspection with a full team, or at least alert whoever owned the property now that it wasn't secure. My job was structural evaluation, not security. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I cranked up the AC to cool myself down, but my hands were still shaking. I rubbed them on my pants, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through me. I looked down at my left arm and noticed a patch of skin rubbed raw from scraping against the door. A small trickle of blood stained my shirt sleeve. I cursed under my breath, grabbed some napkins from the glove box, and dabbed at it. I pulled out of the empty parking lot. The building towered behind me, silent and uninviting. I drove down the street, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, even though I knew there was nothing to see. My mind replayed the sounds I'd heard in that hallway, the heavy footsteps. I kept wondering if I'd actually been in danger or if I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But the locked door and the echoing corridor were real. I couldn't ignore that. I also remembered the feeling of being trapped, that sudden panic that I couldn't just walk out the way I came in. By the time I hit the main road, I'd calmed down enough to think clearly. I still felt an ache in my arms from forcing the door. My shoulders were stiff. The tension had left me wiped out. I passed a few gas stations and a grocery store before deciding to pull over for a moment. I parked in a small lot, took another look at my scraped arm, and checked for any more injuries. Nothing serious, just some bruises and a bit of raw skin. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I checked a text from my boss asking if I had a chance to evaluate the site. I typed a quick reply that I ran into some problems and would explain later. As I drove the rest of the way back to my office, I tried to stay focused on the traffic and the normal flow of life around me. People were going about their business, shopping, pumping gas, driving their cars. That felt strange after my tense moment in the hallway. I felt a bit paranoid, checking my mirrors too often. But with each mile, the sense of relief grew. At least I was out, safe, and able to get on with my day. When I finally parked at my workplace, I sat in my truck for a minute, shutting off the engine. I stared at the steering wheel. My heartbeat was back to normal, and I felt the weight of exhaustion. I grabbed my gear, walked into the office, and told the receptionist I needed to talk to the boss. I still hadn't decided how to phrase the story. It sounded ridiculous in my head. I got locked in a corridor and heard footsteps, so I broke the door's hinges to escape. But that was exactly what happened. I made my way to my boss's office, sat down, and recounted the whole thing. I described the jammed door, the dark corridor, the footsteps, and my forced escape. He stared at me, then said he'd look into the ownership situation. He wasn't mad about the door. He just seemed concerned about my safety. He thanked me for giving him a heads up. I went to my desk, wrote up some notes about the structural issues I was able to observe, and then decided to call it a day. My nerves were shot. I couldn't focus on anything else. Even as I drove home, I couldn't get the memory out of my head. I felt that flash of fear again when I pictured the hallway and heard the echo of those heavy footsteps. I'd never had a job site experience quite like that. I still don't know who was in there or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But my hands still ache sometimes when I think about how hard I had to pry that door open. I haven't gone back to that building since. Whenever I drive by that part of town, I keep my distance. It's a concrete shell that looks completely empty. But I know what I heard. If I ever go inside again, I'll make sure I bring a team. No more solo visits. I don't like feeling trapped, and I don't ever want to repeat the experience of being stuck in a dead-end corridor while listening to unknown footsteps coming my way. That moment taught me that no matter how routine a job might seem, there's always a chance it can go sideways. And sometimes the only way out is to break the door down